You don't exist. Take a perk and a talk of that shit. Money swallowed like sis. Dead up perfect in the kid. Got a billion who sang on my head. Look up better put on the road I just spent. I know we got $1 million. The devil that shit ain't not cheaper again.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to MangaMuse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the fourth part of What If Naruto Meets Sekirei. Special note, this fanfic is written in a masterpiece of ZuttoAragi on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Everyone snapped their attention up when a new, gravelly, pompous voice spoke up. Well, look at this. The great demon of the hidden mist, beaten by a bunch of kids. Pathetic, someone said. Everyone looked ahead and saw Gojo, standing on the unfinished end of the bridge with a mass of nearly 300 bandits behind him. Disgust and rage filled Naruto as he prepared to stand and attack, but stopped when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up and his eyes nearly fell out of his head. Standing over him, a hand on his shoulder and pure rage in his eyes, was Zabuza. Without looking at Naruto, he said, "Look kid, don't sully your hands with this tripe." The bandits started shouting but shut up with a glare from Zabuza. Zabuza finally looked at Naruto and said, "You and Haku, the two of you made me remember something. The whole reason I became a rogue ninja." "The hidden mist village," Naruto said knowingly. Zabuza adorned a pathetic smile under his mask and said, "Tell you did she? Haku's always been a bleeding heart, too pure to kill anyone and would always spill her heart out at a moment's notice." Zabuza looked down with a hint of sadness, mainly because she couldn't tell me. Naruto interrupted, "Zabuza, I want to be perfectly honest, I don't like you. Actually, I hate you, mainly for what you did to Taki. But Haku, she didn't. She loved you, practically worshipped you. She was willing to, and did, throw her life away for you." Zabuza actually had tears tugging at his eyes. Naruto added one last thing. "Also, she didn't tell you those things, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want to burden you. At least that's what I think." Zabuza smiled sadly and said, "I hope you're right, kid." Zabuza looked back at Naruto and said, "I probably don't deserve to ask you this, but you see, I've spoiled my hands with the blood of money, killing not for my goal, but for the rio of swines like Gojo." Gojo squeezed his cane in anger at the brazen insult, but did nothing else when he noticed Kakashi glaring at him. He just swallowed nervously and let Zabuza continue. "So I can't become the hero the mist needs, but you can. You could free it from Yagura's cursed rulership. It's not my place to say this, but I want to impart that burden, and the sign of it. My sword is now yours." Naruto's eyes went wide at that. Zabuza had just bequeathed the executioner's blade to him. "I also want to give you Haku's legacy. She never killed not unless it was the only way to protect those people that were important to her. She even killed to protect me. I know I can't make up for what I did to her or Taki, but I just hope they can forgive me." Naruto chuckled mirthlessly. "I'm not too sure about Taki, but as for Haku, she had nothing to forgive." Zabuza smiled slightly and then shed a single tear and said, "Boy no, Naruto Uzumaki. I know you can save the Mist Village." Zabuza walked back over to Kakashi and took his chakra blade, then pulsed his own chakra into it. "Take my legacy, my dream with you, but leave the blood with me," Zabuza said. Gojo stepped back and started flailing his cane. "Don't just stand there, kill him." The bandits all rushed at Zabuza at once. He smiled under his mask and rushed back at them, dodging and ducking, while slicing and slashing them to pieces. Toyotama watched with awe and happened to see Izumi. Irritated, but glad she could leave, she walked over to him. She stopped with fear and confusion when he put his hand up and glared uncaringly at her. "Don't come near me," he said coldly. Toyotama flinched and could only sputter, What?" He narrowed his eyes and said, "Because you were weak, Ikea was terminated, and you didn't even try to stop it. I have no need for security risks." He turned his back and said, "Consider our contract terminated." He walked away as the crest on Toyotama's back turned black and then disappeared as she fell to her knees and stared vacantly. Zabuza tore through most of the thugs, himself covered in cuts and slash wounds, with multiple bladed weapons stuck into his body, blood flowing down his visage. He looked coldly at Gato and walked forward with a dislocated leg. Gato took several steps back, but stopped. He realized he reached the edge. He looked at Zabuza and could only say one thing as he advanced. He really is a demon. That was the last thing Gato said before Zabuza ran him through with the chakra sword, and then tossed him over the end of the bridge. He stumbled back and fell backward with a satisfied smile. After several seconds he looked around confused as he realized he hadn't hit the ground. He turned his head and saw two tendril-like chakra arms holding him up. He laughed weakly and said, "Naruto, can I have one last request? Take me to Haku. I want to see her one last time before it's over." The chakra arms wrapped around him and gently hoisted him into the air. They carried him over to Haku and set him down next to her. Zabuza smiled at her and brought a hand to her face and said, "You were always so caring. I can only hope that I go to the same place as you." Zabuza trailed off as he closed his eyes and death finally took him. Snowflakes began to fall from the sky in a brilliant display. One landed on Haku's eye and trailed down the side of her face in a streak. Kakashi sighed and looked at the sky. Then he said, "You never know, Zabuza, you just might." Naruto smiled sadly at them, then turned back to Akitsu and began to tremble when Kurama spoke up. "Kid, give me control of your body for a minute," he said. Naruto narrowed his eyes and responded, "Why?" "I promise I won't take permanent control. I just think I know a way to save her." Naruto thought for a moment and answered, "I don't trust you enough for that, but I'll give you a shadow clone." "Fair enough," he answered. Naruto created a single shadow clone, and it donned his wild hair, red slitted eyes, thickened whisker marks, and elongated nails and fangs that he got when he used Kurama's chakra. "Let me see her back," he said in a raspier version of Naruto's voice. Naruto nodded and lifted her up. Kurama pulled down the back of her shirt and saw the Sekirei crest. He narrowed his eyes in thought and then placed 2 fingers on it. He released some of his chakra into the crest, causing it to glow. Immediately afterward he jerked his hand away, taking out a strange purple chakra Naruto had never seen before. After all of the strange chakra left Akitsu's body, the crest dissolved with flashes of light and hisses of steam. Everyone watched in confusion and then shock when Akitsu's eyes fluttered open slowly. She looked around tiredly and smiled weakly at Naruto and said, "I'm still here." Naruto nodded and smiled with tears in his eyes and wrapped her in a loving hug. Only Kakashi and Kurama noticed the red flow of energy that came from Akitsu's wounds as they healed. Kurama smiled to himself and then said, "These shadow clones don't last long with my chakra, do they?" Naruto could only chuckle as he turned to Kurama and said, "You can leave." Kurama gave a small lopsided grin before the clone burst out of existence. Kakashi smiled tiredly and everyone else just smiled happily. Even Sasuke couldn't suppress his smirk. Naruto stopped after a moment when he saw something out of the corner of his eye. He saw Toyotama slumped over near the entrance to the bridge, not moving. Intrigued and wanting to help even if she was the enemy, she was still a Sekirei being manipulated by Minaka. Naruto picked up Akitsu and walked over to Toyotama. She glanced at him weakly and asked, "Are you here to terminate me?" He simply asked, "Where's Izumi?" She glared and then went placid again and said, "He left and he broke our bond too." Naruto glared this time. He asked, "What will happen to you?" She shrugged. "Don't know. If I can't find another Ashikabi, I'll probably be taken back to the labs and readjusted, then released again." Naruto thought for a second then nodded. "So you can be winged again?" She looked at him in mild surprise and confusion and asked, "Why would you be concerned? I tried to kill one of your Sekirei." Naruto shook his head. "I saw that none of the injuries Musabai suffered were enough to terminate her. Plus, I saw when you tried to stop your partner from continuing to assault Akitsu." She frowned and asked, "What's your point?" He smiled and said, "If you're looking for an Ashikabi, I'm available." "What?" Most everyone aside from the now conspicuously unconscious Sasuke shouted. Naruto turned and said, "She's still a Sekirei. All of this is Minaka's fault. I have nothing personal against the Sekirei, most of them." Toyotama raised an eyebrow. "What about Ikiya?" He scowled and said, "She took it too far. I was also being controlled by Kurama's chakra too." He sighed and asked, "Well, you want to be my Sekirei or not?" She stood shakily and said, "Are you sure?" He smiled and answered, "Yeah, like I said, for the most part I don't blame the Sekirei for this. You're all being manipulated by that bastard." She nodded and said, "Then yes, I would like to become your Sekirei." He smiled and spoke, "Right." He placed Akitsu down and then stepped toward Toyotama, placing a hand on her cheek. That action alone caused her to blush. Izumi had never shown that level of affection. He brought his face to hers and she reciprocated automatically. They both closed their eyes as they inched closer to each other. Their lips soon came into contact and Toyotama flinched. The sensation wasn't the same cold, commanding feeling she was used to with Izumi. Naruto's was kind and accepting. After pressing past her reservations, she gave herself to the kiss and their lips locked together. Toyotama could feel the massive influx of chakra from Naruto's body as it coursed through hers, enveloping her in a sensation she hadn't experienced in a long time, safety and warmth. She felt safe with Naruto, that he would accept her and not deny her or use her like Izumi did, which made her feel warm. Soon, her crest remerged and multiple long azure wings sprouted from her back and flexed, expanding to their full girth and brilliant light show. The two slowly parted and Toyotama smiled. She could feel his calming emotions from the bond. Naruto smiled too, but then frowned. Even though Akitsu alive and well, he couldn't feel her through the bond. So he wondered, "Do I need to wing her again?" "No," Kurama said simply. "It wouldn't work even if you tried," he clarified. Naruto became sullen, but why? Because it was that crest that created the bond. It was also that crest that killed her when she received enough damage. Without it, she would have been just fine, ironically enough. She and I assume the others have regenerative powers similar to my own. The only difference is that odd crest seems to stop the regeneration if they receive what would be fatal blows to a human, he said to Naruto. Naruto narrowed his eyes and responded, "I don't really get it, but maybe I can study it when we get back to the leaf." "I would suggest keeping this to yourself, kid," Kurama advised. Naruto gave a mental nod and was returned to awareness when Kakashi walked up to him. "Kakashi," I smiled and said, "Well, we better get going. The others are probably worried." Naruto nodded and was about to head out when Naruto was pounced on by Taki. Naruto fell to the ground with Taki on his lap. "Naruto," she yelled happily while straddling him. Naruto gulped and said, "Hey, Taki." She smiled and said, "I'm free now." Which means, she paused and put a finger up to her lips seductively. "We can finish the winging," she stated with a wink, only to freeze when she felt killer intent from 3 different directions. She looked up and behind her and saw that Toyotama, Musabai, and Akitsu all had their heads down and their eyes shadowed. Suddenly, all 3 gained a dangerous glint and Taki screamed. Their reverie stopped when one of the thugs stepped forward and said smugly, "Hey now, don't get too comfy. With Gato dead, we still need something to make our efforts worthwhile." He smirked as the others picked up their weapons. Naruto scowled as he walked over to the executioner's blade and 2 of his chakra arms came out of his back and helped him hold the sword. He sent the thugs a cold glare and released some of Kurama's killer intent, resulting in the visage of a glowing, demonic fox head appearing with bared fangs. Naruto then said coldly, "I suggest you get lost, or I'll practice with my sword on your bodies." Before anyone could say anything else, somebody spoke up behind them. "And you'll have to go through us too." The shinobi and Sekirei looked in amazement to see Inari standing at the head of all the villagers brandishing different weapons and ready to fight. Naruto smirked and said, "I've got enough chakra left to join in too." He, surprising even himself at that point, formed 15 sign-less clones. Kakashi sighed and said, "Well, can't let you have all the fun." He formed the shadow clone sign and said, "Multi-shadow clone jutsu, Kakashi style." And with that, 20 Kakashi clones burst into existence. The bandits started shrinking back and one shouted, "This ain't worth it." The whole group clambered onto a boat Gato traveled in and left immediately. Naruto looked back at the villagers and smirked, then asked, "How did you know we were fighting?" Inari was about to speak when Homura walked forward with crossed arms and said, "I could feel Sekirai's emotions. That, and the thick, chakra-laden mist didn't hurt." Naruto chuckled weakly and said, "Oh right." Tsunami walked up and said, "Why don't we get you home so you can recover?" The group arrived at Tezuna's completely disheveled. After dinner, Kakashi was ready to congratulate his team when he noticed that each of them had already fallen asleep. He couldn't suppress his nostalgic smile as images of his first B rank with Minato flashed in his mind. Kakashi took Sasuke to his room while Naruto and Sekirai's Sekirei took them. The next morning, Naruto woke up and tried to stretch. He frowned when he couldn't move and looked to his left emotionlessly. His left arm Musabai was wrapped around his arm in a vice grip and drooling on his shoulder. Naruto couldn't decide if he was disgusted or aroused, so just went with an uncomfortable shiver. He looked to his right and saw Akitsu had gotten herself wrapped by his arm, which just so happened to have his hand resting on her ass. She had her head tucked into his neck, releasing cold breaths in her sleep. He looked down and to his left with a deepened frown and saw Yuzume had wrapped herself around his torso on the right, wedged in between him and Musabai. He looked down to his right with one twitching eyebrow and saw Taki wrapped around his right side, rubbing her mostly exposed breasts into his bare chest. He looked straight down with two furiously twitching eyebrows and saw Toyotama lying on top of him. He sighed and suddenly wished he wore more than his boxers to bed, primarily because it seemed someone put them in the dryer. Kakashi was in a similar situation with Hibiki and Hikari wrapped around his torso. But rather than be uncomfortable like Naruto, he had the world's biggest perverted grin and a very content-eye smile. He was personally on cloud 9. He couldn't wait to tell Jiraiya about this to give him more material. Sakura was contently sleeping, believing she was snuggled up tight to Sasuke and sighed contently and perversely. Homura just sighed at her with a smirk. Sasuke's sleep was much less content. He dreamed he was running from a mad woman trying to either kill him or, in his mind, do worse things. The worst part was he jumped onto buildings and she would follow right behind him. He tried ducking down an alley, but she simply appeared from the shadows, seeming to teleport. He eventually seemed to get away, right as a pair of chocolate brown arms wrapped around his neck and a couple of heavenly lumps pressed against his back. He woke up with a start sweating profusely. Sighing, he lifted the blanket and then shoved it back down with an annoyed expression. He decided he would wait a bit before going downstairs. His dream happened again several more times before it started actually affecting him, mainly resulting in him sinking back into his old personality with a mix of his new one, resulting in an odd combo of a smug joker, getting one too many slaps on the back of the head from Kakashi. One morning, the three Jounin, and Sekirei were eating breakfast and Sakura kept glancing at Sasuke, noticing his uncomfortable expression. Naruto did too. He was about to comment when he noticed Sakura was concerned too and let her do it instead. "Hey Sasuke?" she asked, concerned. What she hadn't expected was when his head snapped towards her at speeds that should have broken it, and probably did if his pained expression was any evidence. He rubbed the back of his neck and asked exhausted, "What, Sakura?" Now truly worried about him, she thought, "Yes, I can finally get closer to him. Let's do this, cha." Homura sighed, feeling the familiar emotions of what he called inner Sakura. Pushing down her excitement, she asked, "What's wrong?" He debated for a moment and decided it best not to answer. "Nothing, I'm just tired from yesterday." "Oh," she said dejectedly. Naruto looked at Sasuke and decided to discuss it after breakfast. That day, it was Sasuke, Naruto, and Homura's turn to guard Tezuna alongside Kakashi. Once they got to the bridge, Naruto tapped Sasuke's shoulder and motioned to a shaded area under the newly built gateway. Sasuke raised an eyebrow, but nodded and followed as Naruto made 200 shadow clones to work on the bridge. When they got there, Naruto sat down, looked at Sasuke and asked, "What's up?" Sasuke tilted his head and asked, "Isn't that my line?" Naruto smiled and said, "Maybe, but I can tell something's bothering you. Want to talk about it?" Sasuke thought for a moment and then said flatly, "Tease and die." Naruto shrugged and said, "Fair enough." Sasuke rubbed the back of his head light blush and said, "It's a dream I've been having." "About me?" Naruto asked jokily. I'm leaving, Sasuke deadpanned. Sorry. Go on, he said, placating. Sasuke grunted and came back, then continued. I was being chased by this weird woman. I tried to escape, but she chased me. The weirdest thing was she seemed to teleport through the shadows. Naruto scratched his chin and beckoned Homura over. He then asked Sasuke before Homura arrived, was it creepily realistic? Sasuke looked mildly surprised, but nodded as Homura joined them. What do you need? He asked. Naruto looked at Sasuke and said, I'll be back in a minute. Sasuke narrowed his eyes suspiciously, but didn't stop them. They went to another side of the bridge and spoke. Sasuke smirked and activated his Sharingan to read their lips. What they spoke about confused him to no end. Hey Homura, when a Sekirei reacts to their ashikabi, can it manifest as dreams? He asked curiously. Homura raised an eyebrow and nodded. There are 4 levels of reaction. The first is placid, no reaction at all. The second is discovery. That's where the Sekirei starts to become flustered and heated in their ashikabi's presence. The third is called illusion. That's when dreams become involved. The Sekirei and ashikabi will have dreams of each other. They start at sparse intervals and escalate until they both have waking dreams of each other. That stage is usually when winging occurs. The fourth and final level is uncontrolled. That's when the Sekirei has gone so long after reacting without being winged that they start losing control of their powers. Most don't get that far. If they do, there's a possibility their powers could backfire and kill them. Naruto nodded and rubbed his chin in thought. Homura tilted his head slightly and asked, Why do you want to know? Naruto looked at him and said, I think Sasuke's having a Sekirei react to him, which doesn't make sense since he hasn't met any I'm aware of. Homura shook his head and said, They don't all happen that way. Sometimes, there is a very specific person a Sekirei is destined to be with and will react without meeting them. I'm guessing he had a dream. Naruto nodded. Sasuke was completely confused. He was about to go over and ask when a loud crash was heard. Everyone looked to see a spout of water shoot into the air. Naruto looked at and shouted, What the? The spout suddenly shot several cannonballs of water. Naruto was forced to dodge over and over. He soon realized that whoever that was specifically targeting him. A voice then sounded from the spout. Water celebration. Naruto was hit with a blast of water and shot into the water. Homura had an exasperated look and muttered, Great, it's panty flash. Sasuke happened to read his lips and sweat dropped at that comment. Naruto stood up on the water as the spout broke and a figure descended to the water's surface and glared at him hatefully. Naruto flinched under the glare and then noticed the person he was looking at. Before him was a gorgeous woman with long, flowing blonde hair and blue eyes much like his own. She wore a long black dress with a short white underdress that exposes a lot of her bust. She wore a black choker with up-facing white frills and long brown boots with black stockings. Naruto would have blushed at her were if not for indignant expression she had and the water swirling around her dangerously. He looked at her and gulped, crap. In the western area, the Hidden Leaf Village, a girl with long blonde hair that went down to the middle of her back, 2 long bangs down the sides of her face, and a series of bangs across her forehead with amber eyes was running across the village. She also wore a white shirt that started as a choker, extended down with a space revealing a large bust, a short orange skirt with a brown leather belt, long orange gloves that went to the middle of her biceps, long black socks that reached the middle of her thighs and short gray boots. She also had a spear strapped to her back. She was running from a group of Sekirei that were chasing her. Among them was No. 05 Mutsu, and with him were 2 female Sekirei with long blonde hair in pigtails and black dresses with a wide, vertical yellow stripe. One had an Eastern-style dress with a whip that had 1 tail. The other had a Western-style dress and a whip with multiple tails. The group was chasing the spear-wielding blonde to add her to Mikagami's collection. The girl ran down an alley and stopped with a terrified gasp. Right in front of her was a massive wall, with Mutsu and the others directly behind her. She turned around, held her hand to her chest, and cried with horror, What do you want? The girl with the single-tailed whip walked up with a smirk and said, You're going to become our sister, whether you like it or not. She accentuated her statement by pointing her whip at her. "Come with us quietly and you won't be hurt," Mutsu said calmly. The girl tried to meld into the wall to get away when somebody called from the rooftops. "Leave her alone." Everyone looked up to see a man with 3 Sekirei. The man had short dark hair and a black leather jacket. The Sekirei on his left had dark skin, short blonde hair in a HAREM cut with 2 long bangs on the side and blue eyes. She wore a simple black leather bra with 2 gold stars on it and long navy blue gloves that extended to her biceps with similarly colored armbands just above them. She also wore a tight black miniskirt and long black boots reaching just above her knees. One of the Sekirei on his left had short black hair and gray eyes with dark skin. She also wore a small black top with an inverted triangle on her collarbone, an extremely short black skirt and shin-length black boots. His last Sekirei had short blonde hair that had brown eyes. She wore a short-sleeved red belly shirt, blue capri jeans and knee-length white boots along with a sweatband that had a Sekirei crest on it. Mutsu looked at the man and narrowed his eyes. He then scoffed and said, "Sanada Nishi, Ashikabi of West and his Sekirei Kujika, Kuzuri, and Narashino. How irritating." All 4 of them jumped down and Sanada pointed at Mutsu and said, "All right, Mutsu, back off from the lady," spitting Mutsu's name. Mutsu just scowled and said, "None of you stand a chance. Now leave and we will wait until a later date to terminate your Sekirei." "Hey bud, just 'cause you're a single digit doesn't mean you're invincible," the blonde, Kujika, shouted. A vein popped in Mutsu's multi-whip wielding companion. "Oh, back off. You won't win even against us." Mutsu narrowed his eyes at her and said, "Quiet, Mitsuki." Mitsuki just pouted. Mutsu looked at his other companion and said, "Mitsuha, capture Nanami." She nodded and dashed forward, only for Sanada to dash in front of her. She reeled back and cried out, "Fast!" Sanada gave a feral grin and made to punch Mitsuha. Everyone halted when the ground started shake violently and a sector of the city released a vibrant green light. In Yamanaka Flowers, Ino was busy reading a magazine at the register when somebody walked in. She looked up and was about to give her normal greeting when she saw who walked in. It was a boy with messy silver hair and gray eyes wearing a white button-down, long-sleeve shirt with a high-folded collar, a black apron, and a light, black backpack and pale shorts. He walked in and looked around apprehensively. Ino, seeing his blushing face, thought, "Wow, he's so cute, almost as cute as Sasuke." He looked at her and asked uneasily, "I'm looking for someone. Can you help?" Ino jumped at his voice and said, "Can a guy be this adorable?" Ino nodded dumbly and asked, "Who is it?" The boy gained a small smile and said, "A little girl with blonde hair and a white dress." Ino crinkled her brow and thought, but stopped when the ground shook. Whoa, what was that? Ino and the boy ran outside and saw a distant park in the village shining with bright green light. "Coo!" he shouted and ran off. "Wait!" Ino called. The boy stopped and turned around with a worried expression. Ino froze at the expression, but then woke up and asked, "Do you know how to get there?" The boy looked confused for a moment, then depressed and shook his head. Ino walked up to him and said with a smile, "If your friend's in trouble, I'll help. I know my way to that park well." The boy nodded and started to run, but was grabbed on the collar by Ino. Ino growled and said, "Wait, damn it. I gotta make sure Dad knows I'm going out." She walked back to the store dragging the boy and then shouted loudly, "Hey Dad, I'm going out for a bit." Without waiting for a response, she took off, still dragging the silver-haired boy. The third Hokage sat in his office locked in mortal combat with his greatest opponent since the Nine Tails, paperwork. He gave a sigh when he finished half the stack. Suddenly his office shook along with the rest of village. He stood up and turned around to see a bright green light emanating from one of the Leaf's parks. He furrowed his brow in concern and decided his shinobi could handle it. He sighed and turned around. He then grumbled. All of the paperwork had gotten thrown across the floor. He could do little more than sigh. Back in the land of waves, Naruto was busy dodging attacks by the newly appeared water-wielding woman. He was clueless to her hostility. She suddenly appeared in a water spout and started attacking him. After he got a short reprieve, he decided to gather some form of information. "Hey, "Why the hell are you attacking me?" he shouted. The woman narrowed her eyes and said with an authoritative tone, "Art thou a twit? I am attacking thee for thou art my ashikabi." Naruto's face went completely blank. He suddenly shouted, "Then why are you attacking me?" She curled back from his shout and retorted, "I refuse to be bound to a monkey such as thee humans. I shall show my power to the world through mine own means, not through the subjugation of some such ape." A sigh was heard nearby, and the two saw Homura shaking his head with Sasuke standing nearby. Homura looked tiredly at the woman and said, "Tsukimi, must you insist on assaulting him?" She pointed at Naruto and said, "He is my ashikabi. I refuse to serve a human. Thou must know my pain, for thou art free as well." Homura chuckled and said, "Nope, I've been winged." Tsukimi took a moment to blink, then shouted, "Thou must jest." Homura shook his head. "No, it's true." Naruto looked between them and then to Sasuke, whose gaze made him gulp. Seeing a chance to get away from Tsukimi, he mouthed the words, "Let's go over there and talk," since he knew Sasuke's Sharingan would read it. He pointed to the shore and Sasuke nodded. The two head away while Homura kept Tsukimi busy with an argument. Naruto walked over to a tree and panted, "Damn, I thought I was a goner." He looked up to thank Sasuke but reeled back at his accusing gaze. He chuckled weakly and rubbed the back of his head and asked, "You probably want to know what's going on, huh?" Sasuke just narrowed his eyes. "Well," he started but was cut off by a shout. "How dareth thee flee? Ye coward!" Naruto cringed and said to Sasuke, "Look, I'll explain later, but we gotta go now." Sasuke was confused but saw an enraged Tsukimi rushing at them and disappeared. Naruto's arms hung loosely in astonishment and muttered, "Must have had training from the fangirls." He looked at Tsukimi and shrieked, then took off. Tsukimi was stomping around the forest looking for Naruto and found him and was ready to attack. She stopped when she saw another Sekirei with him. Naruto was sitting at the river's edge soaking his sore legs with Musabai beside him. "You okay, Naruto?" she asked worried. He looked at her and smiled weakly. "Yeah. I just don't know why that woman attacked me out of the blue." Musabai pumped a fist and said, "Don't worry, if she comes around I'll stop her." Naruto chuckled and said happily, "I'm sure you will." He looked down sadly and said, "I think she's a Sekirei." Musabai tilted her head and asked, "Why?" Staring at his reflection he said, "She mentioned not wanting an ashikabi." Musabai scrunched her nose in intense thought and asked, "I thought all Sekirei wanted their ashikabi." Naruto looked at her with a small smile and said, "Guess not. I just thought she would have stopped attacking me long enough for me to talk." Tsukimi narrowed her eyes in suspicion but listened on. Musabai just listened happily. "If she did, I would have told that was fine," he said plainly. Musabai put a finger to her chin and said in confusion, "I thought you wanted more Sekirei." Tsukimi started becoming angry. Naruto waved her comment off and said, "Nah, I'll always accept more, but I find forcing them to be disgusting. I mean, that's what Akitsu almost got stuck into, and what Toyotama was stuck in. I'd hate to do that to someone." Musabai had stars in her eyes. "Naruto, you're so amazing." She immediately tackled him into a hug. "Ah, Musabai, stop. Ha ha ha, that tickles," he shouted while embraced in her hug. He suddenly went limp when her hug strengthened. Kurama facepalmed. "I'm not sure how many times I can heal his ribs at this rate." Musabai started shaking him and calling worriedly, "Naruto, Naruto." Naruto came to and rubbed his sore chest that Kurama was already healing. "Oh, that hurt." He looked up and cringed. Musabai had a fist balled at her chin with puppy dog eyes and anime tears. "Ooh, Naruto, I'm so sorry," she said pitifully. Naruto chuckled weakly and said, It's fine." They both turned to see Tsukimi walk out from behind a tree with a serious look. Naruto jumped up and got into a taijutsu stance. "Great, want more?" Tsukimi raised her hand and said, "Nay, I am here only to speak." Naruto eased up but was still on alert. After he saw she was serious, he smiled and nodded. He then said, "What about?" Tsukimi narrowed her eyes and asked, "What thee spoke before, was it truth?" Naruto raised an eyebrow and asked, "Was what true?" Tsukimi growled and said, I queried if what thee spoke was truth. Naruto grumbled and retorted, What are you talking about? With an intense blush, Tsukimi finally shouted, Is what thee said of not winging Sekirei unless they wish it truth? A light bulb seemed to click in the blonde ninja's head. He rubbed the back of his head embarrassed and said, Oh, you heard that, did you? After a moment he nodded and said, Yup. If you don't want to be winged, I won't argue. Homura said you were. He trailed off trying to remember her name. Tsukimi walked up to him and said, Tsukimi. He nodded. He was about to speak again when Tsukimi interrupted. Look me in the eyes, she commanded. Naruto raised a confused eyebrow and asked, What? Tsukimi sighed again and said, Look me in the eyes. Confused Naruto complied and looked her straight in the eyes. After several seconds, Tsukimi smiled proudly and said, Good. Naruto was confused again. What is? Looked me in the eyes rather than focused upon my bosom. If, she trailed off, starting to blush. If thee wouldst, she kept trailing off and blushing deeper and deeper. Naruto was confused but didn't interrupt. Finally gathering her confidence and poise, she said with her usual conviction, If thee wouldst like to be my Ashikabi, I shalt not object. Naruto looked lost for several seconds before his brain switched on. Huh? Was all he could say, before sighing and muttering, I really wish she would make up her mind. What was that? Tsukimi said dangerously. Naruto waved his arms defensively. Nothing, nothing. Right. He coughed into his hand and said, We should probably introduce ourselves first. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, he said as he stuck his hand out. Tsukimi walked forward with regal poise, grabbed his hand and said, I am Zonin Tsukimi. They shook hands and Naruto asked seriously, Are sure you want me to wing you? Tsukimi looked unsure but then nodded and said, I wouldst rather be winged by thee than be snared and forced upon by some heathen. She blushed intensely and then asked shyly, So, where shall we consummate our relationship? Naruto went blank again before blushing. What? Where'd you get that idea? She looked irritated and said, 'Tis how it works, no? To complete the winging, we must. She trailed off as she blushed again before smashing him with water and saying, We must share a body. Naruto stood up and shot a nosebleed before bellowing, No, that's not how it works. Tsukimi was perplexed. Then, how doth it work? Naruto sighed and felt a headache and said, We kiss. Tsukimi face faulted. That's it. Naruto nodded. Tsukimi sighed tiredly. I do wish she wouldst have explained this. Naruto was confused but assumed it was her adjuster and said nothing. Tsukimi sighed again and said, Very well. Then let us wing. Naruto deadpanned. I wing you, not the other way around. Tsukimi felt embarrassed again and yelled, Just do it. Naruto sighed and walked over to her, watching as her fair-skinned face flushed deep pink. Naruto smiled mentally, but was externally straight-faced. He put an arm around her waist and one behind her back, pulling her close as she released a small eep. He leaned in close and closed his eyes slowly, and she did the same. Their lips met in a kiss and Naruto could taste her on his breath. She tasted salty like seawater, but had an underlying sweet taste as well. Her Sekirei crest lit up on her back and large wings made of water appeared from her back and flexed outward, pushing against and soaking the many trees in the area. Musubai watched with a content smile as they pulled apart. Naruto gave a wide grin and Tsukimi flushed and looked away. Little did they know, Sasuke watched off to the side and had every intention of grilling his blonde teammate. The bridge was completed 2 days later and Team 7+, the new Sekirei, prepared to leave. Naruto and the group were about to cross under the bridge's overhang when a voice called behind them. Hey, wait up! They all turned to see Inari and the villagers standing behind them. Naruto smirked and shouted, Hey, Inari! Inari, Tsunami, and Tazuna walked up to the group and Inari said to Naruto, Thanks, Naruto. Said Blonde blinked a couple of times and said dumbly, What for? Inari chuckled and said, If it wasn't for you, I would have still been too scared to help out. Yes, thanks to you, the land of waves has regained its strength, Tazuna added. Naruto chuckled while Sasuke just smirked and Sekirei and gave an innocent giggle while she thought, oh yeah, cha, I'm awesome, and so is Sasuke, cha. Homura just sighed and hoped she would stop that soon. Naruto and company said their goodbyes and continued on the bridge. Behind them, Tsunami said, we still need a name for the bridge. Tazuna nodded and said, I've got the perfect one, the Great Naruto Bridge. Tsunami looked at her father slightly confused, so he elaborated. The name that brought us strength, so let us hope it brings strength to the bridge too. It should stand for a long time. On a small hill overlooking the village, there were 2 crosses with flowers on them, as well as 2 headbands. One the cross's 2 names were inscribed. One said Haku and the other Zabuza. After walking for about an hour or 2, Sasuke walked up to Naruto and put his hand on his shoulder. Naruto looked at him mildly confused and asked, what's up, Sasuke? He looked at Naruto with a serious expression and said, I want an explanation, Naruto. You said you'd give me one. Naruto sighed and replied defeated, I did say that, didn't I? Sasuke just narrowed his eyes and the blonde began. All right, stop leering. Okay, listen up. This whole thing is top secret, and I could actually get in big trouble for telling you this. Sasuke raised an eyebrow and took his hand off the blonde's shoulder. He nodded and Naruto continued. Naruto said, this whole thing is some kind of continent-wide event called the Sekirei Plan. Sekirei Plan? Sasuke asked. Naruto nodded and continued. Basically, there are 108 people like Musabai and the others. They all have specific chakra abilities that they have up to low Jonin control over. They have all been released into the Leaf Village to find a person called their Ashikabi. An Ashikabi is a person with specific type of chakra that the Sekirei react to. Sasuke nodded and asked, so what's that got to do with my dream? Naruto answered, dreams are a way Sekirei react to their Ashikabi. If they go a certain amount of time without being winged, their Ashikabi will start receiving mental images of that Sekirei that start off as dreams. Winged? Sasuke asked. Oops, Naruto said with an embarrassed tone. Forgot about that, though I'm not sure how since it's the most important part. He saw how his personal musing were irritating the Raven and said, calm down. Winging is the process where an Ashikabi binds a Sekirei to themselves. Is that what the kiss was for? He asked, mentioning Naruto's winging of Tsukimi. Naruto nodded and said, that's the most efficient way for a Sekirei to get the necessary amount of chakra from their Ashikabi. Doing that creates the bond. The bond makes so that the Ashikabi can feel their Sekirei's emotions, as well as vice versa. Sasuke nodded and said, all right, I get that much. So what else is there? Naruto sighed and said, a lot actually. Essentially, when a Sekirei has found their Ashikabi, they need to go and fight other winged Sekirei. All of the different Ashikabi will fight with their Sekirei until only one remains. Sasuke noticed how Naruto's voice filled with disgust as he spoke. Guess you don't like it. Naruto spat. Course not. The person who's running this whole thing, some insane scientist named Minaka Hiroto, has bred and indoctrinated all of the Sekirei into believing that their only purpose in life is to find, serve, and fight or die for their Ashikabi. I mean, due to some screw-up somebody else made, Akitsu was supposedly incapable of being winged and thought she was nothing more than a piece of garbage. It's disgusting that all of the Sekirei believe that their only purpose is to serve somebody else as some kind of slave, and then die for them in the name of some damned game. Sasuke was surprised. He didn't think Naruto would have such complex convictions about something. He then asked, so, what do you plan on doing? Naruto rubbed his head in annoyance. I don't know. My basic idea is to try and shut down this game and free the Sekirei from believing they're just things. Sasuke looked down in thought and asked, and you think I'm one of these Ashikabi? Naruto nodded. I had a dream about Tsukimi a few weeks ago, and then I winged her. Plus, Homura told me that one main thing about an Ashikabi when they dream about a Sekirei is how realistic they seem. Sasuke blushed thinking about his dream, or more specifically what the woman did at the end of the dream each time. He shook the thoughts away and asked, so, where would I find this Sekirei? Naruto chuckled and said, I wouldn't worry about that. If my experiences are anything to go by, they have a way of finding us. How right you are. A silvery voice spoke up behind them. The two genin tensed and turned around immediately, as did Kakashi and the others. Sasuke immediately froze. Standing in front of them was a dark-skinned woman with waist-length jet-black hair, a bikini top under a shawl, along with a buckled sarong and leather knee-high boots. She had a devious smile on her face and walked towards Sasuke, a pink dusting creeping onto her face as the great Uchiha backed away like a little puppy. She giggled and said in a mixture of mocking and amusement, "Alwa, is the powerful ninja afraid of me?" Sasuke pointed and shouted comically, "Stay away." "Come now, you're my Ashikabi. You should know I can't do that," she said in a seductive voice that caused every cell in Sasuke's body to shiver violently. Sakura could only watch in disbelief as this floozy woman closed in on her Sasuke. Sasuke eventually backed into a tree and looked around fearfully, then looked at her with a strained smile and said, "See, come on, isn't there some other way we can do this?" The woman chuckled with a seductive tone that even got Kakashi a little flustered and said, "Well, there are other, more intimate methods of winging, so very intimate." She then licked her lips in anticipation as she strutted closer. Sasuke put his arms in an X pattern and shouted, "That's not what I meant." Sasuke froze as the woman cupped a hand under his chin and said, "Name's Yahan, and I am now your Sekirei." Sasuke was about to protest, but Yahan claimed his lips for her own. His eyes widened when he felt the pull on his chakra. Multiple large, dark gray wings expanded out of her back and flexed open, then sunk into the ground and became shadows. Yahan pulled away with a satisfied smirk. Sasuke looked at her with his face nearly glowing red. Steam then shot out of his ears and he went limp. Sakura paled and screeched, "Sasuke, no, what'd you do?" Yahan simply chuckled and said, "I didn't do much, just a simple kiss. My guess is that despite his great skills as a shinobi, the boy's got no experience with women. Though I guess his current unconscious state attests to that." Sasuke simply sat on the ground with steam coming out of his ears and his eyes swirling. Yahan put a hand over her mouth and giggled, and as she knelt down and picked him up, she looked at the other shinobi and said, "Guess that means I'm on the team." Naruto blinked a couple of times to process what just happened. After he realized that Sasuke had fainted after a kiss, he began rolling around on the ground laughing loudly with tears in his eyes. "I don't believe it. The great Sasuke, defeated by a kiss, ha ha ha." Sakura steamed and shouted, "Stop it, Naruto. As for you," she pointed at Yahan and accused, "who the hell do you think you are?" Homura sighed and said, "His Sekirei, that's how it's supposed to work." Sakura grumbled and protested. "But, grrr, gah," she screamed and stomped a couple of times before huffing. "Oh boy," was all Kakashi could say with a sigh. After arriving back in the Leaf Village, Naruto and the others were met with an irritated Hiruzen, and Kakashi spent quite a bit of time explaining the new Sekirei. With a sigh, Hiruzen said, "I see. So these new Sekirei are bonded to Sasuke and Sakura now." "Right," Kakashi said with a nod. Sasuke could only look to the side with a blush as Yahan hung off his shoulders. Sakura glared angrily at Yahan while Homura sighed and thought, "This is getting old fast." Hiruzen sighed again and asked Sasuke, "So, what will you do with her?" Sasuke raised an eyebrow and asked, "What are you talking about?" Naruto chuckled and said, "It's normal for a Sekirei to start living with their Ashikabi." Sasuke broke into a glare and shouted, "No way." Yahan rubbed his cheek with her hand and whispered seductively, though loud enough to be heard, "What's the matter? Don't you want me with you?" Sasuke shivered from top to bottom at her words and her breath on his neck and tried to speak, but ended up imitating a fish instead. Naruto couldn't suppress his chuckle and decided to ask, "Hey Yahan, you got somewhere to live?" She stood up straight and shook her head, though still smirking. She then said, "No, MBI didn't provide a place to live for us." Naruto raised an eyebrow, but Homura and Uzum were living at Izumo Inn. Uzum tapped his shoulder and said, "We're a special case. She houses any Sekirei that come to her." Naruto nodded and was about to speak when Sasuke did first. "That works for me," he said plainly. Everyone face-faulted and Naruto stood up and said, "Well, whatever. If you want Yahan, I'll talk with Miya about it." Yahan chuckled and wrapped herself around Sasuke again and said, I'll be just fine with my ashikabi. Naruto snickered and said, I think that settles it, Sasuke. Sasuke glowered and grumbled, whatever, I'm leaving. Without another word, he left the Hokage's tower. Kakashi sighed and said, as cool as he acts, he's really shy. Who knew? Sekirei had stars in her eyes and thought, hell yeah, Sasuke's so shy. Maybe I can bring him out of it, cha. Homura rubbed his temple and thought, she's going to need more tempering it seems. Naruto just chuckled and returned to Izumo Inn. In Naruto's room, a battle was brewing. Tsukimi and Musabai stood opposite each other glaring intensely. Tsukimi with her indignant pride and Musabai with a rather clueless expression. Naruto just sighed. Their battle was over a very bizarre topic. Tsukimi growled and then shouted, halt this imbecilic madness, thou art fallacious. Musabai glared in irritation and confusion. She then stopped and struck her thinking pose, one finger on her chin and eyes pointed up. What's fallacious? Is it yummy? Both blondes sighed. Naruto scratched his head and said, it means wrong, it's just a fancy word. Musabai bopped her fist onto her hand and said with recognition, oh, then why not just say wrong instead of phallic? Tsukimi blushed intensely and Naruto's face faulted then shouted, that's the wrong word. Ignoring her blush and correcting the fistfighter, Tsukimi said, regardless, thou art misguided, for I am Naruto's legal wife, not thee. Musabai adopted her rather adorably angry face and said, so am I. Tsukimi grumbled and said, no, thy art only a concubine, as art the others. For I am the highest number in the group, therefore I am his wife. Akitsu interrupted, ah, you are 9, I am 7, she said plainly. Tsukimi's face dropped at her oversight and Akitsu gave a lazy thumb up at her victory. Naruto just rubbed his head furiously and said, gah, whatever. Tsukimi became quite insulted. Nay, until the present issue is resolved we cannot proceed normally. I am thy legal wife and the others must be informed of such. Naruto growled and said, look, technically you all are. You're all my Sekirei and are connected to me on a level deeper than even husband and wife can be. So can you all stop arguing and just get along? He finished with a hopeful smile. Akitsu smiled lightly and nodded. Toyotama smirked while leaning against the wall. Yuzun gave a thumb up and grinned. Musabai smiled brightly and said, yes, that's why you're so great, Naruto. Naruto chuckled but stopped when Tsukimi chimed in. Unacceptable. Thou can only have one legal wife and that shall be me, she shouted in finality. Naruto lost some of his cool and stood up with anger. You've got to be joking. Have you even stopped to consider what the hell I think about all this? I'm not some damn object you can take possession of. I'm a person, and I'd appreciate it if you'd remember that. Without another word, Naruto left the room, slamming the door behind him. All of Sekirei flinched as he did. Toyotama sighed and rubbed her temple and said plainly, way to go. Tsukimi glared and shouted, pardon, what did I do? Toyotama glared and immediately slapped her across the face. She then bluntly said, it's like he said. You're not treating him like a person, least of all your precious Ashikabi. You're treating him like a thing you choose what to do with. What if he wanted one of us to be his wife? Tsukimi glared pointedly at her asked, such as thee? Toyotama's glare deepened and she grit her teeth. Maybe, or it could be Yuzun or Musabai. What the hell does it matter? He chose each of us to be his Sekirei, to take up a special place in his heart. And by simply demanding what he decides, on something so big too, you're crushing that choice like it's a piece of trash. So yes, Tsukimi, this is your fault. Tsukimi was taken aback and was near tears. She wanted to shout but nothing would come out, so she simply ran out of the room crying. Toyotama sighed and said, great. Out in town, Naruto was leaning against a railing next to the river with a depressed and angry look on his face. He simply stared at his reflection in the water and sighed. So, even with them I'm no different. Damn it, he said as he smacked a fist against the railing. He looked to his right and saw Kakashi holding something he couldn't identify. He looked closely and then flinched. Seeing what he was holding, Naruto pointed and asked weakly, sensei, is that alcohol? Kakashi looked down and nodded, then said lazily, "Yes. Sake actually wants some." Naruto put his hands up and yelled, "What? No, I'm only 15. Kakashi, I smiled and said, "Yes, but a ninja is considered an adult by default. Plus, thanks to your HAREM tenant, you can't get drunk anyway." Naruto blinked a couple times then sighed. He rubbed the back of his head and said shakily, "Yeah, sure." Kakashi handed him one of the small bottles. Naruto thanked him and took a sip, then spit it out. "Blech, this stuff tastes like crap and it burns my throat," he said, sticking out his tongue. Kakashi chuckled and said, "It does that, doesn't it?" Naruto glared and then became crestfallen again and asked, "Something you want, sensei?" Kakashi looked out on the village and said, "Yeah, originally I bought these to have a drink with Hibiki and Hikari, but then I saw how depressed you looked. I thought you could use a pick-me-up." He finished with an eye smile. Naruto glared lamely at him. Kakashi then said, "Plus, I've got some making up to do." Naruto raised an eyebrow and asked, "What do you mean?" Kakashi looked around and then pointed to a bench. Naruto nodded and the two sat down. Kakashi looked at Naruto's expression and thought, "Laws be damned, I refuse to let him suffer anymore." He then asked, "Naruto, do you know who your father is?" Naruto glanced at him and nodded. Kakashi was hard-pressed to hide his surprise. "Who, Regent?" "Must have been, did the Nine Tails tell you?" he asked. Naruto looked at Kakashi surprised. "How did you—" "Lord Third told me privately when he assigned me as your sensei that you've been communicating with the Nine Tails. At first I was worried, but after seeing the way you are now, I'm not as concerned, though I still need to." He was interrupted when Naruto put his hand up. He replied, "Don't worry, sensei, I know. Actually," he started, looking at the sky, "the Nine Tails isn't that bad." Kakashi grew concerned and said, "Be that as it may, the Nine Tails is still the one that killed my sensei and your father." Naruto nodded and tried to reassure him. He'd prefer I didn't give you the details, but it wasn't really his decision to attack the village. Kakashi was skeptical, but went along with it. Naruto continued, "Anyway, yeah, I know the fourth is my dad. Why'd you ask?" Kakashi sighed in a mixture of relief and anxiety and said, "Because there's a law in the village that states we aren't allowed to tell you of your heritage." Naruto raised an eyebrow, then Kakashi answered quickly, "Your father, my sensei, treated me like a son after my father died. He was always there for me and holding me up. After he died sealing the Nine Tails, I told myself I would do everything I could to help you." Kakashi's look became hard as he continued, "But that damned council. They thought you were the Nine Tails and prevented me from doing anything, from adopting you from the orphanage to simply watching over you." Naruto's eyes widened at that. "Didn't you? I mean the Nine Tails killed your sensei, so didn't you?" Kakashi interrupted and looked at Naruto. "Yes, I hated and still hate the Nine Tails, but I know enough about sealing jutsu, and you personally to know that it and you are completely separate entities. Even if you weren't, I'd still have tried just because you are Minato-sensei's child." Naruto was in disbelief. He tried to speak, but ended up just looking like a fish. Ignoring his student state, Kakashi continued, "Since I was prevented from doing anything else, I signed up to be on your rotated Anbu guard and jumped in any time somebody else wasn't available. It was difficult, but I managed to repel most of the beatings and mobs heading your way. I wasn't able to stop them all, simply because I would be removed from your watch if I harmed one of those morons." Naruto hung on his every word as he spoke. Kakashi sighed and said, "But it was just that once, that one attack 8 years ago on your birthday. I can't say for certain, but I think it was purposefully set up that I was never in your guard detail on your birthday, even though I would be on those same days at other times. I heard about it after the fact and rushed to find you. All I saw was the aftermath." Kakashi's eye became misty as he thought back. "It took everything I had not to go insane. I saw you there, trashed by those people." He spat the word like poison with clenched fists. "Fortunately, one of my comrades, and one of the few other Anbu who agreed that you weren't a beast, was there to stop it before it became fatal." Kakashi looked at Naruto and was about to speak when he saw the blonde's face. Naruto had tears running down his face. You really cared that much?" Kakashi, I smiled and nodded. Yeah, it took a lot of work, but I got you on my squad too. They originally wanted to put Kiba in since his scores were worse than yours. Naruto's head dropped, and he said in disbelief, Are you serious? I thought I managed to get the lowest scores. Kakashi chuckled and said, Nope, somehow Kiba beat you on that end, and he wasn't even trying to. They both laughed at that before Naruto asked, Hey sensei. He was stopped by Kakashi. No, when we're talking like this, just call me Kakashi, since I'd like to think we're family, even if I couldn't be there for you. Naruto was in shock, but quickly gave a wide, toothy grin that closed his eyes. You got it, Kakashi. Kakashi smiled and said, You were saying? Naruto nodded and asked again, What was my dad like? Kakashi looked up in thought and shrugged. Well, he was kind, strong, steadfast, and very selfless. Naruto raised a confused eyebrow and asked, Selfless? Kakashi nodded. You remember from the history books about your father's famous battle against over 1,000 stone ninja? Naruto nodded. Using his most famous jutsu, the Flying Raijin, he was able to defeat them all in a matter of minutes single-handedly. But after that, his thoughts weren't on his incredible feat, even though he was being praised for it. Or the people on his side he saved, even though he was infinitely glad he did. No, his thoughts were preoccupied with all the people he just killed. That's the way he was really. He was always more concerned about others than himself. That's part of the reason he did what he did to you. Naruto narrowed his eyes in confusion, so Kakashi elaborated. He was willing to sacrifice his life to save the village, and he also believed so strongly that the village would see you not as the vessel for the Nine Tails, but its cage. Kakashi looked down and squeezed his sake bottle, but they were too blind to see that. All everyone saw was you being the physical manifestation of it. I tried, damn did I try, to change their minds or do something to get you out of harm's way. But the council stopped me at every turn. Nothing I did got through because of them. And as much as I respect Lord Hokage, I just feel he could have helped a bit more on that end. Naruto chuckled mirthlessly and said, I never thought somebody felt that way about me. As for Gramps, he didn't do anything because the council could cause more problems for him than they do already and drain what little power he has left. I wish I could help him, but I can't. Kakashi smiled under his mask and said, I know how you feel. Naruto looked at him and smiled. He then said, Hey, Kakashi. Kakashi looked at him and said, What is it? Thank you, he said simply. Kakashi's eye widened. This is the first time anyone but my Sekirei has simply talked to me like this. As something other than the Nine Tails, he said trembling. Kakashi felt his ire for the village grow. How could they treat someone, a kid no less, like this? It was at that moment that the owner of the nearby store walked out and looked to see Naruto. He stomped over and began shouting, Get lost, brat. He froze when Kakashi sent him a cold glare. I advise you to just walk away. The man trembled with anger, but wasn't interested in having a conflict with a jounin and just swore under his breath as he stomped off. Kakashi sighed and then looked at Naruto, who had his attention off in the distance. He followed his stare and saw the strange anomaly they noticed right after entering the village. Kakashi and the group, tired and beaten, walked up to the village gate and Naruto shouted, Yippee, finally home. Kakashi sighed and muttered, And you were the one so desperate to go on a mission away from the village. They walked up to the guards. The two eternal Chunin gate guards of the Leaf, Kotsu and Izumo. Izumo had shoulder-length dark brown hair that covered his right eye and had a bandana-style headband with the Leaf symbol on the forehead protector. He wore the standard Leaf Chunin uniform with one difference. The collar of the dark blue shirt he wore under the vest went up to his chin and wrapped around the lower part of his head. Kotsu had long, black spiky hair that went in every direction and had dark-colored eyes. He had a bandage strip that crossed over the bridge of his nose and also had a small square marking on his chin the same color as his hair, although it was not hair. He wore the standard Leaf Chunin uniform without the high collar that Izumo had. Kotsu looked at the group and said, Wow, finally back, are ya? 'Bout time. Kakashi chuckled nervously but stopped when he heard several gasps from his squad. He paid a small bit of recognition to the two Chunin before joining his squad. His eye went as wide as theirs at what he saw. Despite them being on the southern end of the village, they could clearly see a large mass of vine-like trees protruding from a park on the northwestern end of the village. "What's that?" Sekirei asked breathlessly as she shielded her eyes from the sun. "Not sure, but it makes me uncomfortable. Come on, let's go report to the Hokage." They all nodded and chose to momentarily ignore the massive forest in the middle of the village. Kakashi looked to Naruto and asked, "Any ideas?" Naruto narrowed his eyes and said, "Not sure. We should check it out later." Kakashi nodded and they began walking. They soon passed by Yamanaka Flowers and saw Ino at the desk looking depressed. Naruto looked and then saw another person next to her. He sent some of Kurama's chakra to his eyes and realized this person was a Sekirei. Kakashi saw Naruto's expression and asked, "Something wrong?" Naruto nodded and said quietly, "That boy," pointing to Shina next to the desk, "he's a Sekirei." Kakashi nodded back and walked in. Ino saw them and got into her professional persona and said cheerfully, "Hey, welcome to Yamanaka Flowers." Naruto put up a hand and said, "We're actually not here for flowers." Ino scowled and asked irritated, "What do you want, Naruto?" Naruto scowled and pointed to Shina. Ino looked at him and became worried. She asked, "Oh, what do you want with Shina?" Kakashi decided to interject before Naruto said anything stupid. "Don't ask how, but we know he's a Sekirei." She perked up immediately and then became frantic. "Wait, why you don't want to terminate him, do you?" Kakashi put a hand and I smiled. "No, not at all. You see, both Naruto and I are Ashikabi." "Really, you too?" she asked. Naruto twitched an eyebrow. "Wait, so you're his Ashikabi?" Ino glared and asked, "Yeah, so?" Naruto sighed and said, "Whatever. I just happened to notice he was staring at the forest over in the north and wanted to see what either of you knew." Shina nodded and said meekly, "Yes, it was created by another Sekirei, my surrogate sister Kusano." "Kusano?" Naruto said. Suddenly it clicked. "Hey, I know you. You're the boy that showed up to take Ku back." Ino immediately straightened and asked, "You know Ku?" Naruto nodded. "Yeah, I met her during one of our very first missions. After spending the day with us, he showed up and took her back to wherever it was." Shina nodded. "My name is Shina, no, 107. A few days ago, Ku escaped from the lab and I was sent to bring her back." At the mention of a lab, Naruto tensed up but hid it. Shina looked down in disheartenment and said, "I spent 2 days looking for her and didn't find her until the explosion of plants. That's when I met Ino." Ino blushed and said, "Yeah, the winging just kinda happened." Naruto narrowed his eyes in annoyance and Kakashi just sighed. Shina looked at them pleadingly and said, "Please, you have to help. I don't know what to do. She's stuck in that forest she made with who knows how many Ashikabi trying to forcefully wing her. I can't sit by and let it happen. Please." He was cut off when Naruto put a hand up. Naruto looked at the two of them and smiled. "Of course we'll help." Shina beamed but then became worried. "But you're a rival Ashikabi." "So?" Shina looked at him in disbelief. Ino raised an eyebrow. He looked at the two of them with determination and clenched one of his fists. "This game, this whole damn thing is disgusting." The two of them gasped and Kakashi smiled under his mask. Raising and indoctrinating the Sekirei into believing that they have no purpose without some kind of master. And then, to make them fight to the death all in the name of some twisted freak's idea of entertainment. Ino looked at Naruto and thought, when did Naruto get so cool? Naruto grit his teeth and said, "I have no interest in going around defeating other Sekirei or having my own defeated. So yes, I'll help you rescue Ku, and I have absolutely nothing in it. I'll help you because she's your family, maybe not by blood, but that doesn't matter." Shina had tears in his eyes and bowed with his head to the ground and shouted, "Thank you." Naruto smiled and said, "Come on, stand up." Shina nodded and did as he said. Naruto looked at Ino and asked, "Is anyone else on your team an Ashikabi?" Ino thought for a moment and said, "Not that I know of, but considering how secretive the Sekirei plan is, I doubt they'd just tell me if they were." Naruto nodded and spoke to Kakashi. Kakashi, I want to request a C-rank mission to rescue Ku. Kakashi was almost taken aback as looked at Naruto. The expression he wore was the exact same one Minato had the night he fought the Nine Tails. This in mind, plus the knowledge that Naruto would do it regardless, caused Kakashi to relent. He sighed and said, "All right, but somebody has to foot the bill." Naruto nodded with a smirk and said, "I'll take care of that. You just worry about getting Sasuke and Sekirei to the forest." Kakashi nodded and Ino piped up. "Wait, Sasuke and Sekirei? What for?" she asked in confusion. Naruto looked at her and said, "They're Ashikabi too. Plus, they're my teammates, so it's only right to bring them along." Ino was in shock. She hadn't ever seen this side of Naruto before. All she could do was nod dumbly. The next day found Team 7 in the Hokage's mission room, standing in front of the desk with disbelief. Sekirei stepped forward and asked, "Wait, another C rank already?" The third nodded and said, "Yes, an anonymous client has requested a C rank mission and paid for it up front." Kakashi scrunched his brow in confusion, then thought he probably asked to not be identified. Hiruzen then continued, "It has to do with the large forest that sprung up the other day. The client has requested that a person within the forest be rescued, since there are unsavory individuals who would try to take this person." Sasuke raised an eyebrow and Sekirei's face contorted in confusion. Seeing this, Hiruzen decided to reveal a bit more. The forest was made by a Sekirei, and there are others within the village who would try to forcefully wing a Sekirei with powers like that of the first Hokage. After their surprise died down, the two genin nodded. "Also, a member of Team 10 was requested for this mission as well," the old man added. "Team 10? Which one is that again?" Sekirei asked. The door behind them opened and Ino, along with Shina, walked in. Sekirei pointed in disbelief. "What? Ino?" Ino just glared at her and said calmly, "I'm not in the mood, Sekirei." Sekirei shrunk back and thought, whoa, she was actually scary for a second. Ino looked at Kakashi and Naruto. The two of them nodded. She did so in return, leaving the other genin and Sekirei confused. Hiruzen looked the group over and said, "Lastly, this is a secret mission, so it is advisable that you arrive in separate groups to lessen suspicion." The group nodded and Hiruzen ordered, "Dismissed." Entering his office, Hiruzen noticed a piece of paper on his desk. He raised an eyebrow and opened it. His confusion heightened when he saw it was a request to meet with the council from Naruto. He looked out of his window in concern and thought, ever since the Mizuki incident, that boy's been nothing but trouble. At least he's not playing pranks anymore. He sighed one last time at the letter and decided to face his greatest foe, paperwork. Seeing the massive stack of it, he glared at Minato's picture and cursed him. Naruto arrived back at the inn to see the elegant landlady waiting for him with a serious expression. He walked up to her and asked, "Something wrong?" "Here," she said simply and handed him a letter. "This came for you in the mail. Don't worry, I didn't read it." He smiled at her and said, "Never thought you would." She returned her own soft smile as he opened and read the letter. As he reached the bottom, his face paled and his eyes widened. Seeing his expression, Miya asked, "What's wrong?" Kakashi had just reached his apartment and saw Hikari leaning in the doorway holding an opened letter. She looked at him seriously and said, "You should read this." He nodded and took the letter. After he finished, his eye narrowed with irritation. Sekirei had just taken her shoes off when her mother called. "Sekirei, you got a letter in the mail," she called happily. Sekirei grumbled and asked, "You didn't read it, did you?" Her mother came to the doorway and handed her the letter saying, "Heavens, no. They say it's bad luck if you're not the first person to read a love letter." "Moon," Sekirei said with annoyance. She opened the letter and gasped at the end, "Oh no." Sasuke had just reached his home when he noticed a letter in the mailbox. He looked at it and thought, nobody delivers to the Uchiha district. This can't be good. He pulled the letter out of the box and tisked when he finished it. Yahan peeked over his shoulder, making sure her chest was pressed firmly against his back. She frowned when it had no effect and asked, "What's it say?" Sasuke read it out loud. "Attention all Ashikabi. Beginning tonight is the race for the green girl. Head to the forest in the center of the village to claim your prize. Signed, MBI. Naruto crumpled the letter and said, "Damn it." He sighed angrily and said, "Looks like we can't wait for nightfall like we planned." He stopped when one of the shadows on the inn's deck darkened and Yahan came out. Miya reacted instantly and reached for her sword, but stopped when Naruto put a hand up. She reassumed her meek landlady appearance but kept her eyes locked on Yahan. Yahan looked at Naruto and said seriously, "Sasuke thinks everyone should go to the park now." Naruto nodded and said to her, "Why don't you tell Kakashi-sensei? I'm sure Ino and Shina are already on their way. I'll alert Sekirei." Yahan nodded and sunk back into the shadow. Miya was about to interrogate Naruto, but he had already left through the front gate. She settled for an uneasy sigh. The Ashikabi all arrived at a rooftop off to the side of the forest and began discussing their plans. "All right, the first thing we need is to know Kusano's location," Kakashi said. He looked at Naruto and ordered, "Since you're our censor, can you find her?" Naruto nodded and Ino blinked in surprise. Naruto's a censor type. Geez, how many more surprises does he have, she thought. Sasuke looked at the group and asked, "Anyone reacting to her?" "Obviously you're not. And even if I was, these two," Kakashi paused, pointing to his Sekirei, "would fry me before I could wing her." They just glared at him with lightning sparking at their fingertips. Sekirei put a hand to her chin in thought and said, "I can't think of anything that would point out that I am." Kakashi nodded and looked at Ino, who shook her head. Despite still stretching his senses to find her, Naruto mindlessly said, "Not me either." His eyes shot open and he said, "Found her." "Where? Where?" Shina asked frantically. Naruto pointed and said, "A little off the center of the park. She's alive and still unwinged, but not moving." "She's probably petrified, poor thing," Ino said sadly. Kakashi looked around and then tensed. He whispered just loud enough for his team to hear him. Quiet." He pointed to the gates below, and they saw 3 people approach the front gates that were guarded by several shinobi not from any particular village. Naruto looked at the guards and noticed their headbands had MBI printed on them, obviously declaring their affiliation to the conglomerate. He then turned his attention to the approaching group. In the lead was No. 05 Mutsu, behind and to his right was No. 43 Yomi. The last one on Mutsu's left he didn't recognize. She had long black hair in a style similar to Musubai's, tied at the back into a long thin ponytail, except that her bangs split. She had an out-of-touch expression and wore a long gray kimono. What intrigued Naruto the most was her weapon. A long, jagged, double-ended bladed weapon that resembled a large, two-pointed shuriken. One end was long and curved, with a dip near the middle of the weapon and the Sekirei crest on it, while the other end was straight with a jagged blade. Despite her airheaded expression, the way she held the large blade showed experience and skill, not good for his side. The guards in front of them wore the normal leaf Anbu uniforms, except they were all black with simple, matching white masks with a Sekirei crest on them. One of the guards stepped forward with an arm-mounted kunai launcher and ordered, "Identify yourselves." Yomi was about to speak, but was silenced by Mutsu. He looked at the Anbu with a bored expression and said, "Let us through, or you will die." Without another word, the front Anbu twitched 2 fingers and the others launched into action. They all ran at Mutsu and the other 2 with a variety of weapons. Mutsu just sighed, tapped his sword on the ground and said, "Ground spike graveyard." Immediately multiple massive spikes made of stone lurched out of the ground and impaled the Anbu, killing them instantly. The leader clenched a fist and began going through hand signs, but before he could finish Mutsu tapped his sword again. "Ground spike," he said plainly. Multiple smaller spikes shot from the ground in mushroom shape and impaled the Anbu multiple times, tearing them to pieces. On the roof, Sekirei and Ino had their hands over their mouths in order not to vomit. The others just glared. Down on the ground, Mutsu began giving out orders. "All right, Yomi, you go get the green girl, Himeko and I will stand guard." Yomi grumbled and said, "Whatever, I'll be back." Kakashi looked to his team and worked out a plan. "Okay, listen up. Mutsu is at least high Jonin level. He would slaughter any one of you in single combat." Sasuke clenched his teeth at that remark, but accepted its truth. "Hibiki, Hikari and I will deal with Mutsu. Sasuke, you and Yahan deal with the other one. Naruto, he waited for the blonde to look at him. Can you spare anyone? Naruto nodded and said, Toyotama and Tsukimi should be able to help. He looked at Sasuke, who nodded. Naruto continued, I'll leave them to you then, Sasuke. Just don't do anything stupid or let anything happen. He emphasized the point with a rigid stare. Sasuke nodded and said, Don't worry, Naruto, they'll be fine. Naruto looked away and mumbled, It's not just them I was talking about. What was that? Sasuke asked absent-minded. Naruto just waved it off. Kakashi nodded. All right then, the rest of you go with Naruto. While you're in there, he's in command. Ino and Sekirei froze and simultaneously accused, You can't be serious. Kakashi gave them a stern look and returned his attention to Mutsu and Himeko. You'll likely encounter Yomi while you're in there, be careful. Sasuke and I will head down first to draw their attention. Naruto and the others will leave when he thinks they're sufficiently distracted. Naruto and Sasuke nodded while Sekirei and Ino sighed. Kakashi then prepared to give the order. Ready now. Immediately, Kakashi, Hikari, Hibiki, Sasuke, Yahan, Toyotama, and Tsukimi took off towards the battlefield. Sekirei and Ino sighed again and Ino said irritated, Wonderful. Naruto will probably have us take off immediately. Sekirei nodded in agreement. They both perked up, however, when they noticed he hadn't yet given the order. They bathed their attention on him in surprise as he waited silently. After several seconds, he finally motioned silently to go and shot off. Sekirei and Ino took a moment to catch up with his speed, and they along with the others joined in as he ran under the cover of the shadows. Mutsu and Himeko stood waiting for Yomi to return when they both heard a noise to their left. They both tensed their grip on their weapons. Mutsu grit his teeth when he noticed the new group contained Kakashi. He said with annoyance, So, we meet again, Kakashi. Kakashi narrowed his eye and said, So we do, Mutsu. Kakashi pulled out a kunai and got into a taijutsu stance as the lightning twins did the same with lightning crackling at their hands. Hikari pulsed chakra from her feet and launched into the air while Kakashi ran straight for Mutsu and Hibiki flanked him. Mutsu frowned and said, Pointless. He swept his sword along the ground in an arch and said, Ground spike barrage. Spikes of rock launched from the arc he made, rocketing towards Hibiki and Kakashi. Hibiki brought up her hands and called out, Polarity wall. A wall of electricity formed in front of her that spikes smashed into. She grunted as the force pushed her back. Kakashi surged chakra from one of his feet and flipped over the spikes and continued his charge against Mutsu. He swung his kunai forward and Mutsu partially unsheathed his sword to block it. The point of Kakashi's kunai clanged against the flat edge of Mutsu's blade, and he could see himself in the reflection as they struggled for dominance. Mutsu finally relented when he noticed the twins barreling at him with charged punches. He pulled back, causing Kakashi to stumble, spun clockwise, and landed a kick in Kakashi's sternum and sent him tumbling before jumping back to dodge the incoming attacks. He winced and noticed a cut on his shoulder. He looked at the trio and said with a bored tone, Not bad. He charged forwards at blinding speeds and swiped his sword in an arc, barely missing the lightning trio. Kakashi cursed at his speed and said, Damn, looks like I'm going to need the Sharingan for this one. He uncovered his right eye and opened it. Mutsu had no response towards this and instead continued his attack. Kakashi gripped multiple kunai in both hands. He had his fingers through the rings of 5 on each hand and had 4 in between his fingers. He launched the barrage of 18 kunai and said, Shadow kunai jutsu. The 18 kunai became 90 in a massive smoke burst that barreled towards the Sekirei. Mutsu narrowed his eyes and stabbed the ground, calling out, Shield wall. A massive wall of stone rose out of the ground and blocked the kunai. Mutsu narrowed his eyes again but widened them and moved just as the 90 kunai exploded. With minor singes and the pressure damage, he was shot backwards and flipped several times before landing and skidding along the ground. He jumped again as the twins shot 2 concentrated blasts of lightning that he barely dodged. Kakashi came up to his side with another kunai ready to strike. Mutsu grit his teeth and smacked Kakashi's arm away but received a punch to the stomach in return. Kakashi then said, And this is for earlier. He did a spinning heel kick that slammed into Mutsu's chest and sent him tumbling. He stood up with the wind knocked out of him and said while catching his breath, You're stronger than before." Kakashi assumed another battle stance as his Sekirei landed beside him and said calmly, "I wasn't trying before, didn't want to cause too much damage. But now," he stopped as he made several hand signs. Mutsu prepared for another strike as Kakashi finished his signs. "Now, I'm not so worried." He slammed his hand onto the ground and shouted, "Earth-style, multi-mud wall." Mutsu looked around in surprise as a veritable stadium was made by surrounding walls of stone. Kakashi glared and said, "Now you won't get away." Mutsu grit his teeth and tapped his sword on the ground. Kakashi launched forward and said, "Oh no you don't." Smashin', Mutsu tried his signature move, but was stopped by a punch from Kakashi. He tried to knee his gut, but the Jonin caught it and flipped over his back and tried a sweep kick. Mutsu jumped forward and tapped his sword lightly at an angle and launched several stone spikes that Kakashi jumped over. Kakashi then launched a barrage of shuriken and kunai. The twins looked at the two frazzled and Hikari said, "We should just stay out of it, shouldn't we?" Hibiki nodded weakly as the intense battle continued. Mutsu glared as another kunai grazed him. He decided to fully unsheath his sword and launch himself at Kakashi. Kakashi pulled out a chakra blade and met his attack and the two locked blades. Mutsu grit his teeth as he felt them match evenly. Kakashi then flinched as he felt another pull of chakra from the Sharingan. Mutsu noticed this and took advantage by slamming his into Kakashi's stomach. Kakashi stumbled back as he coughed some blood into his mask. "Kakashi!" the twins shouted. Without missing a beat, they divided and flanked Mutsu prepared to strike. Mutsu was about to continue his assault on Kakashi when he saw the twins flank him. He jumped back as they shot lightning blasts at his location. He raised an eyebrow, however, when, instead of frowning that they missed, the twins smirked. He quickly realized why. Their stream of lightning had conjoined and become one long strand. Kakashi grabbed the middle and the twins encircled Mutsu. He looked around as they completely surrounded him with a ring of lightning and said, "Damn." The lightning trio then called out simultaneously, "Lightning Eye." The circle then filled with lightning and Mutsu hollered in pain as the massive circle of lightning electrocuted him thoroughly. Straining to move with the electricity surging through his body, he tapped his sword against the ground and released his charge technique. The three lightning users stumbled as the ground below them fractured and caved in. Kakashi was stable just long enough to see Mutsu escape through the top of the surrounding wall. He surged chakra from his feet and covered his Sharingan as he gave chase. The two of them reached the top of the wall and prepared to fight when an explosion within the forest stopped them. They both looked at it in confusion. Kakashi quickly turned his attention to Mutsu but sighed when he realized he was gone. Unable to decide if he should give chase or not, he simply fell on his ass with a grumble. Sasuke approached Himeko, who had a dopey smile on her face. Despite her carefree and absent-minded expression, Sasuke felt unnerved. He looked at her and smirked. "Guess you're our opponent, eh?" Himeko smiled and got into a loose stance and said happily, "So it seems. I hope we all have fun together." Sasuke felt a chill run down his spine. Everything about her screamed useless, but something about her sent chills to his bones. He calmed down when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked to his right with mild surprise and saw Yahan smiling at him, for the first time honestly instead of seductively. She said calmingly, "Your first Sekirei battle? They tend to be a bit more informal than shinobi battles, but you'll be fine." Though he didn't show it, he appreciated her words. He smirked and said, "Of course I will." "Art thou done jabbering?" Tsukimi asked shortly as water formed into blades around her arms. "For I would like to finish this conflict swiftly." Toyotama just smirked and got into a staff battle stance and said, "The first fight with a new Ashikabi, wonder how it'll be." Sasuke saw their confidence and couldn't suppress his smirk. "All right, let's do this." He charged at Himeko and launched several shuriken. Himeko reacted instantly and twirled her blade around, deflecting them all. Toyotama came up on her right with a jab that Himeko deflected with her blade. Himeko then came in with a stab using the reverse side that Toyotama barely dodged, getting a small scrape in the process. Yahan appeared in front of her with her own weapon. a curved dagger with a small jewel near the base. She smirked and ran towards Himeko, before fainting and running around her. She then depressed the jewel on her dagger, and a portion of the blade shot off attached to a wire. She looped the launch section through a hole on Himeko's blade. Said Sekirei watched in mindless awe as she did this, then gave a sleepy smile and tugged on the blade, lurching Yahan off her feet. Himeko then dashed towards the Sekirei and tried to kick her, but was stopped by a wall of water. Tsukimi slashed at her with her water-encased arm, but Himeko met her blow for blow. She scowled and said, "Foul wench, stop blocking." Himeko then responded in a sleepy tone, "But if I do that, you'll hit me." Tsukimi gained a tick mark and said, "That's the point." She tried for another jab, but the sleepy-looking Sekirei jumped acrobatically over and was met by a tag team of Sasuke and Yahan. Yahan launched her blade while Sasuke threw a kunai attached to ninja wire. The two weapons lodged in Himeko's blade and the duo ran around her, tying her up. Himeko looked with a drowsily impressed expression before twirling her blade again and snapping the wires, sending the two fighters slamming into each other. Rubbing his sore face, Sasuke grunted and said, "For someone who seems so out of it, she's good." Yahan nodded while nursing the bump on her cheek. "Water celebration," Tsukimi shouted as multiple streams of water launched at Himeko. Himeko mindlessly danced through the jets with only getting wet before turning and dashing at the water user with extreme speed. To stop her, Toyotama went for an upward slash that Himeko blocked by slamming her blade down and hurtling over it. She gave an expression surprise when Tsukimi punched her in the face, sending her skidding across the ground. She put a hand to her face and had a shocked expression and said sluggishly, "You actually hit me. I'm impressed." Tsukimi growled and said, "Gah, 'tis not a fair fight. Sekirei combat is supposed to be one-on-one. I cannot concentrate with ye interlopers." Sasuke glared and said, "We're having just as much trouble as you." Sasuke scowled and then got an idea. "Hey, Tsukimi, can you surround her in a water prison?" Tsukimi raised an eyebrow and asked, "Dost thou mean a bubble?" Sasuke twitched an eyebrow and said, "Yes, basically." Tsukimi scoffed and said, "Naturally. That thee would have to question me is insulting." Sasuke went into a full scowl and shouted, "I was just making sure." Tsukimi sighed and said, "So be it. What is thy plan?" Himeko saw the group talking and put a finger to her chin and said lazily, "I hope they're not planning anything." Tsukimi nodded with a smirk and said, "That may work." Sasuke smirked back and said, "Just wait for my signal." Tsukimi scowled and said, "Just do not tarry too long." Sasuke gained a tick mark but suppressed it and moved to attack Himeko. Himeko smiled lazily and charged at him as well. He pulled something out of his pack and held it in the air. It was a large with 4 curved blades on it. Sasuke held it up and flicked his wrist, causing 3 of the blades to move and form a large shuriken. He held it in front of him and smirked. "Demon Wind Shuriken, Windmill of Shadows." Himeko started clapping. Sasuke nearly face-faulted and pointed at her saying, Why are you clapping?" She held a hand to her cheek while her other arm was through the hole on the blade and said sleepily, "That was so cool." Sasuke immediately became frazzled and twitched several times before saying with confusion, "Okay, whatever." Shaking his cobwebs free, he continued his charge as Himeko did the same. Their blades locked and they pulled apart, sidestepped before slashing again and did this several times. Slashing with their blades colliding, then pulling apart before sidestepping and attacking again. To an outsider, it would look like a dance. After several seconds, Sasuke launched a sweep kick that tripped Himeko and shouted, "Now!" Tsukimi immediately raised an arm and trapped Himeko in a sphere of water. She tried to get free but couldn't move. She then looked at Sasuke and blinked in confusion several times. He smirked, placed a hand on the sphere and said, "Lightning-style current." The sphere was surged with electricity that shocked and electrocuted Himeko inside. She released muffled screams as she was zapped within the bubble. After several seconds, the sphere collapsed and Himeko fell in a heap, with the puddle around her sparking. Sasuke was about to check her condition when there was an explosion in the forest. He looked in that direction and shouted, "What the?" Kakashi ran up to him and said, It's probably Naruto. Let's hurry. Sasuke nodded, and the entire group ran into the forest to check on the situation. Right after the battles against Mikagami's Sekirei began, Naruto and the others dashed off into the forest. After running down a path for a bit, Ino suddenly stopped and then changed direction. Naruto watched her leave and called, "Hey, where are you going?" She turned back and shouted, "I think Ku's this way." Naruto raised an eyebrow but followed nonetheless, as did the others. "Hey Naruto," Homura said, getting the blonde to stop. "Yeah, what's up? Actually, let's keep walking while we talk. Don't want Ino getting too far ahead." Homura nodded and continued to speak while they ran. "We need to be careful. I have reason to believe Sanada Nishi is here." "Why's that?" the blonde asked. "He's known as a gatherer of Sekirei," the fire user said with poorly hidden disgust. Naruto crinkled his eyes in confusion. "Ya mean like Mikagami?" Closing his eyes in thought for a moment, Homura responded, "No, not exactly. He gathers them, but he doesn't wing them." Naruto was utterly confused now. "What sense does that make?" Homura shook his head. "Not sure. But the weirdest thing is that he doesn't keep them." It was Sekirei who interjected this time. "Wait. What do you mean doesn't keep them?" Homura looked at her and said, "The Sekirei he gathers but doesn't wing. If they start reacting to an ashikabi, and that ashikabi happens upon the Sekirei, he lets them go. For a fee though." "Great, another jackass who sees this whole thing as a way to entertain himself," Naruto deadpanned. Musabi spoke next. "That's horrible. How could someone use the sacred bond between an ashikabi and Sekirei to make money?" Naruto was actually impressed by the contempt in her eyes. She suddenly seemed more mature. They all stopped when they heard a scream. They ran to the location and found Ino kneeling on the ground with a wound on her side and Yomi standing nearby, struggling to keep Kusano calm. Let me go! I want to go see Big Brother Shina," Kusano shouted, kicking and flailing her little limbs. Yomi glared and said, "Cut it out, you lil runt. If you don't, I'll hack of your limbs. After all, you don't your hands to make these things grow, do you?" She taunted the small blonde with an evil smirk. Kusano wouldn't stop flailing and crying for Shina. Yomi then got an even bigger smirk and taunted, "All right, Pipsqueak, if you don't stop flailing." She paused and pointed her scythe at Shina, who was trying to help Ino, and said, "I'll hack him to pieces." Kusano immediately stopped flailing and resorted to quiet sobbing. "Good girl," she said with a smirk. "Let her go." Yomi turned around right as a set of feet collided with the side of her head, sending her flying right into a tree with a resounding thud. Naruto got back up and looked at Kusano, then Ino. He glared and asked, "Ino, are you all right?" She looked at him nastily, but then cringed and said, "Yeah, I've got a few medical supplies." She quickly changed the subject. "What about Ku? Is she all right?" He smiled and pointed to the frightened blonde being caressed by Yuzume. Ino smiled contently, but then became serious and said, "I can't really fight right now. Think you can take her, Naruto?" He grinned and said, "Come on, I beat Sasuke." She scowled and said, "Don't think I've forgiven you for that, you moron." He twitched an eyebrow but ignored her insult and said, "Yeah, I'll take her." He stood up and pulled out a scroll with a big smirk. He opened and said, "You should feel lucky, Yomi." The scythe user glared and screeched, "Oh yeah, and why is that?" His smirk grew and he opened the scroll and then smeared some blood on it, resulting in a large puff of smoke. "Because you're the first person I'm going to use this on in actual combat." Yomi looked at him confused, but then shrunk back when the smoke cleared. Naruto stood with the executioner's blade lodged in the ground, holding on to the handle at the second rung, while two of his chakra arms held the first and third rungs. He smirked again and hoisted the blade up, then gripped it at the fifth rung with his other hand, while his two other chakra arms held onto the fourth and sixth ones. Yomi growled and then smirked. She then taunted, "Look at you. You need those weird chakra arms just to hold that thing up. I'm not only more experienced with my scythe, I can swing it faster. Plus, I've got wind blades. You're no match for me." Naruto smirked, but a bead of sweat rolled down his face as he thought, "It pisses me off, but she's got a point. Hopefully the strength training I've been doing with my weight seals has paid off." He steeled himself and surged chakra from his feet, dashing forward with a wide swing that Yomi easily blocked. She winced, however, when the extra force of the blade caused her to slide. She glared and sent a kick at the ninja that he blocked with his own foot. He then blasted chakra from that foot and knocked her down. He hoisted the blade in the air and swung down. Yomi rolled to the side and dodged, but frowned when she saw the nick on her dress. Naruto glared and thought, damn it, this thing's too heavy. I'm going to have to dispel it. He sighed and the blade vanished. Yomi smirked and taunted. Awa, is you sword too heavy? She snickered as he glared at her. He decided that for now, he'd take her down the old-fashioned way. He formed his favorite hand sign and shouted, Multi-Shadow Clone Jutsu. 40 clones then burst into existence, causing the scythe wielder to blink several times at the massive number. Naruto and his clones charged and Yomi sent out wind blades, destroying the clones in mass waves. This had the side effect, however, of filling the area with smoke. This was exactly what Naruto wanted. The next thing she heard was Naruto shouting, Rasengan. Naruto charged out of the smoke with the chakra ball in hand, but Yomi brought up her scythe to block. The two were locked until the Rasengan burst, sending Naruto soaring back and knocking Yomi off balance. She grimaced at the blonde and was about to strike when she felt a foot collide with her back, sending her tumbling along the ground. Everyone looked to see Kuchika standing triumphantly with a peace sign. Naruto pointed at her and said, Don't be so cocky, I did the most damage. Kuchika stuck out her tongue and pulled down one eyelid in a mocking gesture. Naruto just trembled and was about to shout again when Homura hollered, Look out, Sanada's coming. Naruto looked to his right and nearly fainted as a pair of tornadoes barreled towards him. He shrunk back and shouted, What the hell? One of the tornadoes shouted, Fang over fang, as it plowed towards him. Naruto jumped out of the way as the twin twisters hit the ground, kicking up a massive dust cloud and sending rubble flying. Naruto looked up and saw who was standing there, with Kuchika behind them going, Yay Kai Sanada's here. Naruto blinked a couple times then shrieked, That's not Sanada, that's Kiba. That's not Sanada, that's Kiba. Naruto shrieked as Sanada Nishi and his Sekirei came to aid him and the others in defeating Mikagami's Sekirei. Kuchika sighed and said, Welp, that cat left the bag quick. Sanada stood up with a growl and said in irritation, Seriously? Way to go, Naruto. As the dust cleared, Sanada stood up and glared at the blonde. Naruto blinked and then asked, Wait, if you're not Sanada, then who is? Kiba scratched his head and said with a sigh, There never was a Sanada. He then crossed his arms and said with a pout, It's just a cooler name than Kiba. Naruto facepalmed and said, You have got to be kidding me. So you're the Ashikabi of the West, and the best alias you could come up with was Sanada. Kiba growled and shouted, Yeah, so what? Naruto stood up and shouted back, Sanada just means West, so that's a stupid name. Well, it's better than Maelstrom. Is not dog breath. Enough, Homura shouted as he set the two on fire. After they put themselves out, Naruto looked at Kiba and then to Yomi, who was standing shakily. So, what do you plan on doing, Kiba? He asked. Kiba raised an eyebrow and asked, Isn't it obvious? I'm going to have Kuchika deactivate her. Hey, I'm still here, damn it, Yomi shouted. Kiba twitched an eyebrow and said, Yeah, so, you can't beat Kuchika. Kuchika made a victory sign and Yomi growled. The scythe wielder flailed her arms and shrieked, Wanna bet? Kuchika got into a fighting stance but was stopped by Ino. Ino walked over and said, No, I want to handle her. Shina trembled somewhat at Ino's expression. Holding on to Kusano's little arm, Ino said with anger, I want to pay her back for hurting Ku. Yomi growled and brought up her scythe and said with a smirk, Yeah, right, not with that gash on your side. Ino snarled and said, Too bad for you, I know a lot about plants. Yomi blinked in confusion and looked at Ino's wound, seeing it covered in a medicinal paste. She grumbled as Ino pulled out a kunai and Shina stood up. Turning to Ino, he said, You know, Ashikabi aren't supposed to fight Sekirei. Ino smiled and said, I know. Her expression hardened as she turned to Yomi, but I can't just let her hurt Ku like that. Kusano watched as Ino prepared to fight and smiled. Yomi growled and said, "Your funeral." She froze almost instantly, however. Ino was confused and looked around. Nearly a dozen Sekirei walked into the forest around Kiba. Kiba walked up and said with spirit, "You can't beat all of us, can you?" Yomi trembled and then growled and shouted, "Curse you." She prepared to run out of the forest, but was stopped when Sasuke and Kakashi blocked her path. Sighing, Kakashi said lazily, "Unfortunately, we can't let you leave her active." Yomi began shaking as she realized she would be terminated. Naruto watched and sighed. He then asked Kurama, "If they terminate her, think you can remove the mark?" "Probably, but we'll need to stay behind," he answered. Yomi dropped to her knees as Hibiki removed her Sekirei crest. Yomi then slumped over as it vanished. Kakashi looked up and saw Naruto's expression and nodded. Naruto gave an imperceptible smile in response. The copy ninja looked at Kiba and said sternly, "Now that that's done, Kiba, we need to talk." Kiba stiffened and sweat dropped, then asked, "What about?" Kakashi narrowed his eye and walked over, grabbed him by the collar, and dragged him limply out of the forest as the others followed. The only ones remaining were Ino, Naruto, Shina, Hibiki, and Kusano. Ino sighed and said, "Well, Ku, you all right?" Kusano looked at her and nodded, "Yep." Naruto scratched his head and formed a shadow clone that Kurama possessed. Ino looked at him curiously as the clone took on Kurama's features. Kurama knelt down and put 2 fingers to Yomi's back and leaked of some of his chakra into the spot. Ino walked up to Naruto and asked, "What are you doing?" Naruto looked over his shoulder at her and said, "Releasing her." Ino tilted her and asked dumbly, "What?" "I can't really say anything right now, but let's just say she's going to be different," he told her. She narrowed her eyes and said in surprise, "Wait, you're going to reactivate her?" He nodded in response. Angry, she shouted, "You can't be serious. She tried to capture Kusano. Are you really?" She stopped when she felt a hand tug at her skirt. She looked down at Kusano, whose eyes were watering. Ino knelt down and asked, "What's wrong, Ku?" "Let her go, please," the little girl pleaded. Confused, the bleached blonde asked, "But why, Ku? She tried to hurt you." Kusano nodded and said, "She was just listening to the mean man." "Mean man?" Naruto mumbled. "She must mean Mikagami," he reasoned. Kurama pulsed his chakra and then started to pull. As he did, a gelatinous mass of thick, dark purple chakra came out and the Sekirei crest reappeared, sizzled and disappeared completely. Ino put a hand over her mouth and asked with horror, "What is that?" Naruto pulled out a scroll and sucked the chakra into it and said as the clone dispelled, "That is the chakra that composes the Sekirei crest." Ino turned blue and said, "That's disgusting." Outside the forest, Kakashi scratched his head with a sigh as Kiba sat on the ground like he just peed on the rug. Kakashi said chidingly, "So, why exactly have you been doing this?" Kiba tilted his head and asked, "Doing what?" "Selling Sekirei," Kakashi said plainly. Kiba blinked a few times and said dumbly, "Selling them? I haven't." Kakashi narrowed his eye and said, "You've been finding and holding on to Sekirei and then charging money when they find their ashikabi." Kiba shrugged and asked, "What? No, I haven't. If I have a Sekirei who isn't winged and they find their ashikabi, I hand them over. I only charge for protection if a Sekirei or ashikabi wants me to keep them from having to fight." "What?" Sasuke asked. Kiba twitched an eyebrow and said, "If I find a Sekirei that doesn't have an ashikabi, I keep them safe with me until they find their ashikabi. When they do, I hand them over. As for charging money, I only charge when someone asks for a service. There are a bunch of ashikabi and Sekirei out there that don't want to fight. Unfortunately, there are others who want to or love to. Sometimes the weaker ones will come to me and pay me ryo so that they stay at my place and have one of my Sekirei with them as protection, or me specifically if they're being hunted by someone specific." "Wait, so you're not selling Sekirei?" Sekirei asked in disbelief. "No, that's sick. I don't sell Sekirei. I charge for protection, that's it," he denied. "That's rather noble, for a mutt," Sasuke said quietly. "Shut up, jerk," Kiba shouted, receiving a kick to the back of the head from Sekirei. Back in the forest, Yomi started to wake up and then sat up with a jolt. She looked around and saw Naruto and the others and blinked in confusion. She then asked, I thought I was deactivated? Naruto asked. She turned to see him sitting on a rock and nodded dumbly. He stood up with a stretch and said, well, you were. I completely removed your crest though. So now you can never be deactivated again and your powers are full. You don't need the Naruto anymore. Yomi narrowed her eyes suspiciously and asked, why? Why'd you do that? Naruto scratched his cheek and said mindlessly, no reason really. I just think it's wrong for all of the Sekirei to have to effectively die if they lose. Plus it prevents them from being tethered to someone. Yomi was uncertain of what to say. This person, this Ashikabi, had just given her total freedom for no reason other than he felt like it. She was about to ask him to explain, but he was already walking away with the others. After walking for a bit, Shina stopped and said, hey, can you guys wait for a second? Naruto looked back and nodded. Shina placed a hand on one of the trees and said, Death Garden. Immediately, all of the trees emitted a dark green light and then began to turn brown and decay. Naruto and Ino could only look around in surprise as the forest fell to pieces around them. Outside, everyone watched as the forest literally died in front of them. How? Sekirei asked in amazement. That's likely Shina, Homura said. Shina? You mean Ino's Sekirei? Sasuke asked. The fire user nodded in response as the forest fell apart and Naruto and the others walked out. Musabai and Taki immediately ran up and hung off of Naruto, happy to see him even after such a short time. Tsukimi paled at seeing them hang off her husband. Yahan grinned deviously and flung herself on Sasuke, resulting in Ino and Sakura shrieking and Kakashi only sighed. Naruto turned to see Kiba lying on the ground and asked, What are you doing down there, Sanada? Shut up, Kiba said gruffly. He got punched by Sakura for saying something stupid, Taki said flatly. Naruto turned to the side and mumbled, That's not very hard. Sakura grew a tick mark and threatened, If you're saying anything bad, Naruto, I'll clock you. Naruto just put up his hands defensively and asked, So what's going on? And where did all these Sekirei come from? Are they Kibas? Kakashi looked down at the dog boy, causing him to freeze, and said, Not exactly. Care to explain? Kiba was about to explain, but Naruto put up his hand and said, Homura already told me. He sells Sekirei, right? I'm not selling them, damn it, Kiba said as he stood up. That's not what I heard, Naruto said chidingly. Growling, Kiba stood up and said, I told I'm not. I don't charge for the Sekirei I protect until they're winged. I only charge when a Sekirei or Ashikabi specifically ask me for protection. That true? Naruto asked the multiple Sekirei behind Kiba. One of the Sekirei, a girl with long red hair, nodded, and then looked at Naruto with a devious grin. Naruto's sweat dropped, but then looked at Homura irritated. Homura looked down in shame and said, I suppose the rumors could have been a little skewed. Naruto simply twitched an eyebrow and said, Well, guess you're off the hook then. What are gonna do? Standing up, Kiba said, Go back home. As Kiba walked away, Naruto said, Hey Kiba. The dog boy looked at him over his shoulder. I like what you're doing, it helps out with everyone else, Naruto complimented. Kiba raised an eyebrow and said, Why, yeah, thanks. He continued to walk away. Naruto smiled and then turned to Ino and asked, So, what are you going to do now? Ino turned blue and said, Well, I'm not sure. Naruto raised an eyebrow and asked, Why is that? Laughing sheepishly, she said, Weevil, I haven't exactly told my dad, so he has no idea about Shina and hiding Ku would be pretty difficult. Sighing, Naruto said, Well, I guess you could stay at Izumo Inn until you figure it out. Mia tends to be pretty good to Sekirei and Ashikabi, so you should be good for a couple days. Not thrilled with staying at the same place as Naruto, she wanted to argue. Once she realized she had no alternative, she sighed and said, Fine. The entire group arrived at Izumo Inn shortly thereafter. As they approached, Naruto saw Mia standing at the front door pretending to sweep and couldn't suppress a smile that crept onto his face. He walked through the gate and waved as he called, Hey, Mia, we're home. Mia looked up surprised and said, My, it's about time. You all missed dinner. Ino and Naruto's teammates were in disbelief that her first concern was missing dinner, rather than the fact that they all looked like hell. Naruto simply played along and rubbed the back of his head and said, "Yeah, sorry about that, things got a little hectic." Miya nodded and finally seemed to notice Ino and Kusano and said, "Well, who might they be?" Naruto nodded in return and pointed first to Ino and said, "This is Ino Yamanaka. She's the one that asked for our help." Ino bowed curtly. Naruto then pointed to Kusano and said, "This is Kusano. She's the green girl mentioned in the letter and the one that made that forest. We rescued her from a forced winging." Miya then looked at Kakashi and her smile warped into an imperceptibly devious one and she said, "And what's this? You seem to have dragged some garbage with you?" Sasuke and Sekirei face faulted and were ready for Kakashi to retaliate. To their surprise, all he did was say, "Nice to see you too, Miya." The group entered the inn and took a break from their grueling task. Naruto sat down at the dining room table and immediately noticed presences around him. To his left was Akitsu, sitting and staring silently as normal. To his right was Uzumi, who was taunting Tsukimi and the others for being slow, and Taki was behind him making lewd motions. However, a quick glance from Miya calmed them all immediately. The room sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes before Ino spoke and asked, "So, someone mind telling me what that was all about?" Kakashi looked at her and asked, "What do you mean?" Puffing her cheeks, she said, "I mean those Sekirei, why were they after Ku?" Naruto sighed and looked at Kakashi, who nodded. Kakashi then explained, "I suppose you haven't heard of the Cardinal Ashikabi?" Ino shook her head and answered, "No, I haven't." Well, put simply, there are 3 different Ashikabi that have amassed enough Sekirei and enough influence that they are considered the leaders of the different sections of the village, Kakashi explained. "Leaders?" she said quizzically. Nodding, the copy ninja said, "Yes. The southern portion of the village, at least in terms of the Sekirei plan, is Hayato Mikagami. The east is commanded by Higa Izumi," that name caused Naruto's fists to clench, "and lastly is Sanada Nishi in the west. Or rather, Kiba in Izuka." "What? Are you saying that Kiba is someone important?" she screeched in disbelief. Cleaning out his ear, Kakashi said, "Yes, sort of. He is one of the Cardinal Ashikabi, which means that within the Sekirei plan he has influence on the other Ashikabi living in his section of the village." Ino sat silently for several seconds, resulting in most having a concerned expression. While Ino was remaining quiet, Sasuke decided to voice a question he'd had for a while. "Kakashi-sensei, what does all of this mean for the village?" Kakashi blinked curiously and then asked, "What do you mean, Sasuke? What bearing does all of this have on the village? I mean, what effects will it have?" he clarified. Kakashi closed his eye and thought for several seconds before saying, "I can't really say, considering most Ashikabi are civilians and not shinobi. I doubt this will have much effect on the military, though I suppose it is possible for some Ashikabi to join the council, but I can't imagine them being Ashikabi causing many alterations. So near as I can tell, the actual runnings of the village won't seem to have much change." During this long speech, Sasuke and Naruto paid full attention, Miya sat idly by, and everyone else had a look similar to a deer looking at an oncoming train. Naruto piped up next. "If that's the case, not that I'm complaining at all, then why is the old man letting this happen, instead of commandeering Manaka's stuff?" The Sekirei adopted worried expressions as he proposed this idea and proceeded to stare down the copy ninja expectantly. He, of course, was sweating bullets. After swallowing nervously, he said, "Well, it's actually pretty simple. MBI isn't actually based within the Leaf Village, so Lord Hawkage has no clout with them. What that means is that if Lord Hawkage tries to interfere in any way, then Manaka would simply take all of his supplies, including the Sekirei, and move them to a new village, which would not only give another village that advantage, it would also separate all of the Sekirei and Ashikabi bonds that have been made. Which also means if Lord Hawkage had tried to limit it to only shinobi becoming Ashikabi," Sekirei began but was interrupted. "Manaka would have taken the Sekirei away," Ino finished. Sekirei simply glared at her, which Ino gladly returned. Kakashi nodded and said, "Correct, so while it would have been better to make it shinobi as the only Ashikabi, Interfering would have been more detrimental than leaving it. Sighing, Naruto looked at Miya and decided to change the subject. Hey Miya. Looking at him with her usual smile, she said, Do you mind if Ino stays her for a couple days? If you still want rent, I'll handle it, he asked. Ino blinked in surprise. Miya put a finger to her chin in thought and then said, Of course, and as long as it's not more than a week, I'll shelve the rent. Ino lit up and said happily, Thank you. Miya simply nodded in return. Miya showed Ino, Shina, and Kusano to the second-floor room at the end of the hall and motioned to it saying, You can use this room for the time being. Ino bowed and said, Thank you. Hopefully I'll be able to figure out how to tell my dad before I leave. Miya simply giggled and said, It's quite all right. My late husband always held to his ideal of never turning away someone in trouble. After getting Ino set into her room, Miya went downstairs and noticed someone out on the deck. She walked over and saw Naruto sitting down looking out at the recently risen stars. Naruto, she said calmly. Naruto jumped in surprise lightly and turned to her. He smiled and said, Hey Miya. What are you looking at? She asked as she sat down next to him. He returned to stargazing and said, Nothing much. A friend of mine from the academy introduced to the mind-clearing powers of sky watching. So, whenever I'm doing some heavy thinking, I like to sit out and watch the sky, regardless of the time or weather. Miya giggled again and said, That sure is a rather interesting hobby. Naruto just smiled lamely and said, Yeah, but the guy who taught me this is pretty interesting too. Bringing a sleeved hand to her mouth with a chuckle, she said, I see. So, mind sharing what's on your mind? Thinking for a moment, he answered, Sure. While we were in the forest Ku-maid, I ran to a weapon using Sekirei, Yomi. Since she used weapons, I thought, rather foolishly thinking back, that I could beat her with a weapon of my own and pulled out the executioner's blade. That presented two problems. The first was I'm simply not strong enough to hold, he said sadly, looking at his hands in disappointment. The second was I was simply swinging it around blindly, and she beat me in both respects. Miya simply sat quietly as he spoke. I was just thinking about that. I mean, even Kiba was better than me in that battle. I hate that feeling. That feeling of uselessness. That feeling is possibly one of the worst feelings. After a short pause, he looked at Miya and was about to speak when he noticed something she was holding. After a couple blinks, he pointed at it, a long wooden sword, and asked, Hey, Miya. Yes, she asked simply, already knowing what he was going to say. Do you know how to use that? He asked, feeling a bit stupid for asking. Looking at her sword, she gave him a close-eyed smile and nodded. Yes, why do you ask? Naruto looked at her seriously for a moment and then asked, Miya, can I ask you a favor? She said playfully. Will you please teach me kenjutsu? He asked. She looked at him and saw the determination in his eyes. For a moment she could have sworn she saw Takedo on that day so long ago. After taking an imperceptible breath, she said, Yes, of course. I'd be happy to teach you. Naruto's face filled with joy and he pumped up a fist and said, Yes, thank you, Ugh. He was interrupted when she hit him on the head with a ladle. She then said, Naruto, I must ask you to be quiet. There are others trying to sleep. His eyes spun as he said drearily, Yes, Miya. After a moment she said, But before we begin, you'll need a sword. Naruto raised an eyebrow and asked, Wouldn't I just use one of yours? Miya smiled sweetly and said happily, Do you really think I'd let a novice use one of my swords? Naruto's sweat dropped and said, Why, yeah, good point. Any ideas then? Miya thought for a moment and said, There's a shop here in the northern part of the village that sells shinobi equipment, isn't owned by that man, and would likely be sympathetic to your unique situation. Naruto blinked in surprise and asked, Are you sure they'd sell to me without markups? Miya nodded and said, Yes, I'm sure. Here, I'll give you directions to it. Naruto nodded and said, Thanks. The next morning, Naruto woke up early and got ready quickly. His Sekirei noticed him getting ready and Toyotama asked, Hey, where are you going? Turning to her, he said, I'm actually going to a weapons shop to get a katana. Raising an eyebrow, she looked at her spear and said, Mind if I join you? This old thing may have been made by MBI, but it's pretty busted. Naruto shrugged and said, "Be my guest." Naruto and Toyotama walked around the village for a while, Naruto holding a piece of paper and trying to ward off the perverted looks of other men. Eventually, they arrived at a small shop with images of several basic shinobi weapons atop a banner. Looking at the name, he sighed and said, "Well, finally found it. The Higurashi Weapons Shop." The two walked in, and directly in front of them was a desk with a register and a girl around Naruto's age sitting at it. She had brown hair tied into buns and steel-gray eyes. She wore a white long-sleeve blouse with a high collar and red hakama-style pants. She was reading a magazine when she noticed Naruto and Toyotama enter. She looked up and said, "Welcome to Higurashi Weapons, huh? You look new." Naruto nodded with a worried smile and said, "We are. I'm here for a katana and she wants a spear." She nodded and looked at him with a devious smile and thought, "He's kinda cute." She then looked at Toyotama, then paled. "Holy crap. Those things are massive," she thought in surprise while examining Toyotama's impressive chest. Gaining an irritated look, she returned her glance to Naruto and called out, "Hey Dad, we've got customers. I'm gonna need your help." After several seconds, a large man with short brown hair and similarly steel eyes walked in. Naruto actually gulped at the extremely large man whose arms couldn't even straighten. He looked at his own arm and could have sworn he saw it droop. He simply sighed. Toyotama couldn't suppress a small smirk at her Ashikabi's act. "All right, hey Dad, think you can help her find a spear while I help, what's your name again?" Tenten asked. Naruto gained a nervous look, then glanced at the large man and back to Tenten and said, "My name is Naruto. Naruto Uzumaki." Tenten tapped her chin and then shrugged and said, "I've heard your name before, but I can't place it. Whatever, let's go." She quickly and energetically grabbed his arm and began to pull him along. One of Toyotama's hairs twitched. Tenten's father walked up and asked, "So, shall I help you find a spear?" She looked past him at Naruto and Tenten with a worried expression, but shelved it and nodded. Tenten took him away and then sighed and asked, "So, what are you looking for?" Naruto took a moment to collect himself and then answered, "I'm looking for a katana." She nodded and pointed to a collection of blades and said, "These are our best products. Take a look and pick what you want. The prices are on the tags hanging off the ends." Naruto nodded with a smile and walked over to the group of swords. After several seconds, Tenten spoke up and asked, "You're just learning, aren't you?" Naruto tensed and then nodded with a pathetic chuckle. Rubbing the back of his head, he said, "Yeah, I'm just seeing what looks good." She chuckled and said, "Well, how about I show you what is good? Also, you may want a practice sword, so you don't cut an arm off." Naruto's face turned blue at the thought, and he simply nodded. Meanwhile, Tenten's father led Toyotama to the spears and said, "Just pick what you want and I'll give you a hand." She nodded with a concerned expression and began searching. After she searched for several seconds, he asked, "Are you worried?" Toyotama tensed and then turned and asked with fake confusion, "About what?" He gave a knowing smile and said, "About my daughter and that boy?" Her eyes narrowed sadly, and she said, "Not really." "Good, because you shouldn't be," he said plainly. She looked back at him, wordlessly asking for an explanation. He gave a hearty chuckle and said, "I can't say I know everything about that boy, but I know quite a bit. I know enough that he wouldn't do anything to my Tenten, though I can't say the same about her." Toyotama's expression changed from confusion to worry. Noticing this, he added, "But I also know he would refuse anything she tries to pull. Plus, she knows how I feel about that." He finished by squeezing on a piece of wood, resulting in it cracking. Toyotama's sweat dropped as she continued browsing, but did so with a slight happier expression. Eventually, she picked a spear. It was a long blue-green spear with a curved blade that appeared to be emerging from the mouth of a dragon. She grabbed it and picked it up, pleased with its weight. She turned to him and said, "I'll take this one." He smiled and said, "Great. That's actually based off of a famous weapon from the clan era." Toyotama examined it and asked, "Does it have a name?" He shook his head and said, "Not really, but I'm sure you can fix that." She nodded and moved to the front of the store. With Naruto and Tenten, they had picked a practice blade that was a simple wooden blade. His actual sword was a steel blade with a black handle wrapped in gray cloth, with a gold cap and gold wrist guard that was a circle with 4 divots around the edge. Tenten looked and said, "So, that the one you want?" Naruto unsheathed the blade and examined it. He looked at his own reflection in the blade and nodded. He then resheathed it. Tenten nodded in return and decided to ask a question that had been bothering her. "Hey, you said your name was Naruto Uzumaki, right?" she asked with a hand on her side. He nodded wearily. Putting a hand on her chin, she asked, "I've heard it somewhere before, but where?" Naruto frowned as she continued thinking. "Tenten, what did I tell you about prying?" Tenten's father came in and interrupted. Tenten frowned and Toyotama looked at him in disbelief. The entire group returned to the front and Naruto paid for the weapons. Naruto and Toyotama gave their thanks and began to leave, but were stopped by Tenten. "Hey Naruto," she said as she ran up to them. Naruto raised an eyebrow, while Toyotama frowned. He then asked, "What's up?" "I'm actually part of a shinobi squad. We usually train at Training Ground 9. If you want, I can give you some pointers, plus I've got another teammate who could help you with taijutsu." Thinking for a moment, he nodded and said, "Thanks, I'll think about it." The two left and Tenten gave a satisfied smirk. Later that day, Naruto met Miya on the deck and said, "Well, I've got a sword. Want to start?" She turned to him and saw his excited smile. She simply gave her own smile and nodded. As she stood, she said, "All right. But first, let's start with just practice blades." He nodded and went to get his. Moments later, he and Miya were in the backyard, both holding their blades. Naruto looked and raised an eyebrow and asked, "Miya, isn't that sword real?" She looked the blade in her and nodded. She then added, "It is. However, when she did works as a practice blade." Naruto nodded and asked, "Can I see it for a moment?" She raised an eyebrow and nodded. She walked over and handed him her sword. He held it in one hand and his practice blade in his other. He balanced them for several seconds as Miya watched in curiosity. After nearly a minute, he seemed satisfied and handed her sword back to her. She raised both eyebrows as he pulled out a scroll. She looked at him and asked, "What are you going to do with that?" He looked back at her and smirked. "Just watch." He opened the scroll and pulsed some chakra into one of the seals. In a puff of smoke was an inkwell and a brush. He opened the inkwell and dipped the brush in it. He then began drawing on the sword, making intricate seals along it. Placing it on the ground, he put his hands above them, and then pulsed some chakra into them. The seals emitted a light glow and then disappeared. Miya tilted her head delicately and asked, "What did you just do?" He picked up the sword and said, "I just used some weight seals to make it the same weight as the real thing. That way I get just a little more advantage." Miya was quite surprised by his ingenuity and nodded, then said, "So, ready to begin?" He nodded and said, "So, how do we begin?" Holding her sword, she said, "Well, the first thing you need is the proper stance." She held her sword with both hands and assumed the proper stance. Naruto looked at her and tried to replicate it, with limited success. Miya shook her head and said, "Bring your hands a little closer together and bend your right knee a bit more." Naruto nodded and did as he was told. "Now you need to bend your elbows more and move your torso a little more to the side." Naruto nodded and did what she told him to. Miya sighed and said, "Why don't I help you?" Naruto raised an eyebrow as she walked over and stepped behind him. Stepping behind Naruto, Miya pushed one of his feet into position with one of hers, pulled the other, and then placed her hands over his, maneuvering his arms into the proper place. Of course, Naruto barely noticed any of this as mind tried to process what happened. When he did, his face turned bright red. As Miya returned to her previous spot, she noticed Naruto's expression and said in a teasing voice, My, you're not feeling hot and bothered by an old widow, are you?" Naruto's face simply reddened further as she teased him. He attempted to defend himself but simply ended up imitating a stuttering fish. After a moment, he simply relented a sigh and said, "Why me?" Miya could only giggle playfully. After he calmed down, he resumed the Kenjutsu pose and Miya nodded and said, "Good, you seem to have good muscle memory." Naruto nodded and said, "Well, if you give me a minute, we can really get things going." Miya quirked an eyebrow and waited. Naruto formed a hand sign and said, "Multi-shadow clone jutsu." 20 clones of Naruto appeared assumed kenjutsu poses. Miya smiled in surprise and said playfully, "Oh my, this is the largest class I've had in a long time." The original Naruto smiled and said, "Shall we get started?" Miya nodded and began with simple movements, basic swings, simple slashes, and a series of basic kenjutsu movements. Naruto and Miya's training lasted for about 3 hours before Miya decided to end it in order to make lunch. Naruto nodded and said, "I think I understand the basics of it. In that case, I'm going off to my usual training spot." "Oh, and where might that be?" Miya asked. Naruto smirked and said, "That's a secret." Miya pouted playfully and said, "Well, at least inform your Sekirei first." He nodded and proceeded inside the inn. "Training?" Musubai asked. "Where?" "Never mind, as long as it's with you it doesn't matter." Naruto smirked and asked, "So, anyone else want to come?" "Certainly. If thou art going with Musubai, then I shall accompany thee to be certain nothing uncouth occurs," Tsukimi added. She stood haughtily with her arms folded. Toyotama nodded and said as she stroked her spear, "It should give me a chance to practice with this new blade." Akitsu simply nodded and said, "I'll follow wherever you lead." Taki simply smiled and said with a finger on her lips, "I hope it's a nice secluded forest, that way we can finish what we started." Yuzume chuckled and said, "Sure, wherever you go something interesting happens." Naruto nodded and said, "Well, in that case, let's get going." They proceeded out of the room but ran into Homura and Yahan. Yahan looked at them and asked, "So, where are you guys off to?" Musubai pumped a fist and said happily, "We're going to go train." Smirking, Yahan said, "Are you now? Mind if we tag along? It's so boring here. Plus, it'd give me a good excuse to drag Sasuke along." Naruto simply sweat dropped and said, "Yeah, go ahead." Shortly after leaving Izumo Inn, the group ran into Sasuke, who seemed to just be wandering aimlessly. Naruto waved and said, "Yo, Sasuke." The Ravenet raised an eyebrow and said, "Oh, Naruto, want something?" Naruto prepared to answer, but was superseded by Yahan, who instantly wrapped herself around one of Sasuke's arms. "We're going to go train, why don't you come along?" she said with a slight pout in her voice. Sasuke's face was already turning red as she had his arm pressed firmly between her breasts. He tried to answer but found himself overcome as she spoke again. Whispering into his ear, she said, "And we could be all alone." Sasuke immediately cupped a hand over his face and said, "Look, I'm pretty busy, so I can't." Naruto tilted his head and said, "Really? I thought you might want to come along since this is the place where Sensei taught me the rasengan." Sasuke was about 2 meters down the road and said, "Come on, what are you guys doing all the way back there?" Naruto blinked a couple times and just sighed. Yahan took a moment and realized that he was no longer in her grasp. After fruitlessly trying to discern how he escaped, she simply jogged to catch up as the group moved ahead. Musubai then added, "Hey, if we're bringing everyone else, why don't we go and get Sakura too?" Naruto thought for a moment and said, "You know what? That's a pretty good idea. Want to make a quick stop there?" Everyone nodded in agreement and the party changed their direction. On their way to Sakura's house, everyone else in the group quickly took notice of something strange. Nearly everyone in the village was deftly avoiding Naruto. Most were simply ignoring him. Some, however, seemed to make a point of sending him nasty looks or intense glares. Sasuke had always known Naruto wasn't popular due to his pranks, but that level of hatred seemed unwarranted. What made it even stranger was that Naruto seemed completely oblivious to all of that. He had a smile on his face and was speaking merrily to some of his Sekirei, mostly Musubai and Taki, since one was also oblivious to the looks and the other didn't care. Tsukimi was not one of them, however. She was keenly aware of the nasty stares people were sending her husband. Unable to stomach the looks anymore, she decided to interrogate him. "Naruto," she said sternly. Naruto turned to look back at her and responded with a simple, "Yeah, what's up?" "Why aren't these people sending these such foul gazes?" she asked, her face betraying her calm voice. Naruto raised an eyebrow and said with a chuckle, "Didn't you know? I was called the prankster king from hell when I was little." Up until I was about 14, I was always playing insane pranks. One of my favorites was to paint the Hokage faces. This revelation enticed both Yuzume and Musubai immediately. The two began to pester him, so he regaled the stories of some of his most famous and most infamous pranks, ranging from painting the Hokage faces to placing genjutsu seals on the Chunin bathrooms to make them think the stalls were filled with beer. That one got him in big trouble. Tsukimi wasn't satisfied. It was only for a moment, but she felt it through the bond. Merely mentioning the stairs and the people around brought up something she hadn't experienced during her short time with him. She could feel pain through the bond. She frowned as it seemed he was preoccupied with his tales and that she would seemingly not get an answer. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 5. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author ZuttoAragi on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.